Welcome to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions. Your host tonight is the author of the Pro-Black Compendium and Zuberi and the Maroons of Ma'at, the Pan-African Nationalist Oni. Oni, what are we discussing tonight?
Peace, family. What aren't we discussing tonight? Nah, I'm playing. We're discussing Consciencism, Chapter 2, right? I might have said that word wrong, but again, it's like, who cares, right? So this is Chapter 2 of Kwame Nkrumah's work. Hopefully you guys can hear me. I'm still sick. I'm recording this the day after I recorded Chapter 1, right? I realized where I missed out, but it was like 2 minutes in the recording of when the audio died. So I'm not going to just, do a whole 2-minute video on the audio that was missing. So instead of that, if you have any questions about that that one paragraph, just message me on the Discord and I'm completely there for you. All right. Other than that, I also decided, look, it's a 4-hour stream. I'm not going to, premiere it like I usually do. On Sundays, I'm like, everybody come on, gather around, we're doing worship. Instead, I'm just going to send it out, Obviously, I won't hear any feedback if you were like, hey, I'd rather you do the live stream. But, it is what it is, right? Other than that, though, before we get into this thing, I want you to remember that I'm part of a podcasting network.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the Revolutionary Matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Pro-Black Perspective on KWAZ Radio.
All right, family. Y'all ready? Y'all ready for this? All right, Chapter 2, Philosophy and Society. It is obvious from the foregoing skeleton history of philosophy that philosophy could very easily come to be divorced from human life. So, obviously what I was telling you last week was, I guess for you last week, for me yesterday, but what I was telling you last week was that he's disappointed with the astutes. And it's like, that's the same type of consciousness that all of us arrive at, where we're just, in the ebony tower, they call it. Or I think white folk call it the ivory tower, where it's like, hey, you're up in this tower doing all sort of academic stuff, but the people are outside. Now, I want people to also understand this, though, that you're supposed to actually isolate. Like I said, go back to the ancient Egypt. They did isolate their knowledge base from the masses, right? And this is something this is actually a real practice that you want to undertake, And the reason why I say you want to undertake it is because, the people in power, that's what they're doing. Like sometimes if it ain't broke, you don't fix it. Now, I did point out there are 2 different models. There's the model of when you have racial harmony and racial purity, then you could have the knowledge base all, disseminated among the people. But now that you're in a constant state of war, right? In the warship, you have to realize that you have to keep information to yourself. Just the other day, in fact, I'll tell you guys this, that these Asian countries are coming out with missiles that are hypersonic. Okay, hypersonic means they go faster than the speed of sound. Hypersonic also means that the normal missile defense, which is, hey, this missile is coming at us at this speed, right? At a certain subsonic speed, we can then detonate it before it hits us, right? But because it's coming at a subsonic speed, you can do that. When it's coming at a hypersonic speed, it's, oh, wait, what? There's a missile. Oh, no, it's explosion. I didn't know there was a missile. So, but the reason why they could develop this thing in secrecy, and the reason why they could develop it before the Western nations, and the reason why the Western nations do not understand how to do it is because they didn't put their information out there like that. Part of your discipline as a human being is to kind of keep the right information to yourself. That's why, like when I said I went to Ghana, nobody knew. Nobody knew. Not even my closest people. The closest people to me didn't even know. I just told them like a week later. Oh, by the way, I'm in Ghana. You know, only person that knew probably was the U.S. government, because the U.S. government making sure to know. I mean, information is. I'm not gonna say information is power because I wrote the book of power, but I'm gonna say that information is pretty damn important. Okay, let's go. It becomes so abstract in certain Western universities as to bring its practitioners under the suspicion of being taxidermists of concepts. And yet the early history of philosophy shows it to have had living roots in human life and human society. Philosophy had its origins in theological speculation. The earliest theological speculations were a conglomeration of thoughts milling around the great ideas of God, soul, destiny, and law. At every point, these thoughts enjoyed a practical inspiration. For in those far-off days, the religious life was one of the cardinal concerns of human existence. That was a time when it was sincerely believed that man's cultivation of the gods at the same time as his crops was one of his major purposes on earth. Religion and worship were preoccupations of day-to-day life. They were the ways in which man conducted himself in his privacy before others and in the presence of his gods. So, again, he's just saying that philosophy used to have practical application, in the sense that, even religion, which was a day-to-day thing, religion was a major subject for the philosophers, and that religion was a day-to-day practice. So, but of course, again, he's actually really focused on Europe and Western philosophy. Like, I don't just call this philosophy, I call this Western philosophy. So, but like, it's kind of like you wouldn't like that from an African person, but, again, this is a man who liberated a country, so like he can do that. You know what I mean? There are certain things you would hold against him, like I said, the miscegenation. But if you just happen to have a deep background in Western philosophy, it's not the worst thing in the world. Now, obviously, if you read the Book of Power, I'm against Eurasianist. I'm against Eurasian focused philosophy. All that kind of stuff. But I'm going to give this brother a pass because I had a good time in this country. You know what I'm saying? I had a good time in this country. When my country high gets down, I might change the title the way how I usually do. But until then, I'm going to say, you know what? This brother's all right. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, even much later than ancient times, even as recently as the Middle Ages of Europe, other concerns of Europe, all right, other concerns of life were tyrannically subjected to the religious concern at the insistence of the clergy. Economic concerns, without which the clergy themselves could not have survived, were required by them to be confined within the limits of human sustenance. Right? Just double checking that you guys can hear me. To transgress these limits was, in their eyes, to indulge greed, and so to hazard their disfavor in this life and the divine disfavor in the afterlife. Suitably, therefore, the chief concern of philosophy continued to be an elucidation of the nature of God, of the human soul, of human freedom, and of kindred concepts. According to the notion of philosophy, when the primary concerns of human life are differently conceived, philosophy reveals a different bias. And as society becomes differently organized, philosophy is differently conceived. During the European Renaissance, when man became the center of the universe, the human mind and the ways in which it might fix the limits of what is real became the chief topics of philosophy. There was a growing attempt to identify what could be with what could be known, and this tendency later attained its subtlest and most definitive statement in the critical philosophy of Kant. The rise of rationalism was indeed one whole stream of thought which kept reality firmly within the light of human reason, until in the writings of Leibniz process came to be more analogues in nature of logical relations. In this way, the limits of human understanding came to be identified with the limits of nature. This idea survives today in the notion that logically there are no mysteries, that to every question there is an answer, and there is nothing on earth, beneath the waters, or in the heaven above, which is in principle unknowable. So, of course, he's just going back to the same evolution of philosophy thing. He's saying, look, at one point, philosophy was still practical, but it's gradually becoming impractical, and it's gradually becoming unrelated to society. Now, I don't want to say that I want to say this is a little bit of a typecast, a little bit of a revisionist kind of outlook. I'm more of the opinion that philosophy always had practical and impractical aspects to it, and maybe, but I could concede that there's maybe a pattern that it's gradually becoming more and more impractical, more and more academic, more and more removed from general society. But again, like, that really more speaks to the institutions of power and the reality that, again, I want to reiterate that the that how you organize your educational system, right? How you organize your educational system. It's kind of like, I want to point it this way, right? Lawyers write in a way such that a lot of the lay people cannot understand. Philosophers speak in a certain way such that a lot of lay people can understand. Because when you do that, right, what you do is that you then can put a barrier between people without saying you're putting a barrier between people. You know? There's actually this, I think his name is Lord Metternich, okay? So, John Edward Bruce once writes about this person. So, Lord Metternich, I put it inside of on my website on the collected quotations and so on and so forth. And what Lord Metternich says, and I don't like calling white people Lord, but that's the name that I got for him, or Metternich or whatever, right? What he says is, he describes something that's really fundamental for African people to understand about white people, okay? So I'm going to just look it up really quickly so that I could quote it properly, right? I just got to get my page to load. You know how internet is. Let's see. Okay, Metternich. He says, "Gentlemen, behold the true philosophy of society. Gentlemen in the palace, serfs in the field, and an impassable barrier between." Okay? So it's not Lord Metternich, it's Count Metternich. I just remembered it wrong. And John Edward Bruce says of that, he says, the Count Metternichs of America today have the same thought. All right? But the reason why I point this out is because you want to, the way how class is organized in Europe, and it might even be just a universal way of class. No, sorry. The way how class is organized in Europe, not universally, but in Europe. You have the gentlemen in the palace, the serfs in the field, and an impassable barrier between. Okay? They do not want the serfs in the palace, right? So if education were something that were not difficult, right, then the serfs would be in the palace. And that is completely against the philosophy of Wazungu. Now, when you come into America, what you realize is that the serfs are the Africans, and the gentlemen are not necessarily all the whites, but they are the whites in power. And the idea of a serf, an African, a formerly enslaved, an ex-slave, what have you, being in the palace or in the White House or in the executive chair, or in the, and not being checked, if you will, right? That's just something that they don't want. And that's how it's supposed to be, realistically speaking. I don't necessarily agree with, actually, no, I'm going to say, an impassable barrier. I mean, if the barrier is passed, it has to be passed by what will benefit the gentleman in the palace. You understand? This is the same thing that we saw in, classical African civilizations where, this is one of the most insightful things that I picked up on before writing the Book of Power, which was that when you look at ancient Kemet's first dynasty, right, the people in the palace were not the majority or not the same ethnic group as a lot of the Egyptians outside of the palace, right? So what that tells you, I'm not going to say that it was an impassable barrier, right? But what that tells you is that it was the Africans, right? The Africans from the South who came in and established a colony mostly for their benefit. And this is what nations do. They really form things for their benefit. And what happens is that as you develop your educational system, right, you develop your legal system, you do want to keep that barrier, although you might not be explicit. You might not be as explicit as Count Metternich. And you might say, hey, look, well, in order to get into this profession, you have to be able to read deeply philosophical works, and you have to be able to pass deeply philosophical tests and exams, and you have to show that you're really committed and faithful to the ruling order. And the only thing that, as like I said, you go back to the Book of Power, you'll see that I quote, what's his name? That's disrespectful, right? But Marcus Garvey, I quote Marcus Garvey. And what Marcus Garvey does or says is that, whereas we might go to the same schools as Wazungu, they have their fraternities. And their fraternities assist them in bypassing the artificial barrier to keep you out, you know? And this is just the basic way of society. It's the same like as if we were to form, or when we form a nation, right? Or when we improve our nations, or we develop our nations, you know, we're going to want Africans in the positions of power, right? And if there are Wazungu who are applying, we want to, you know, kind of discourage them. You know, we want to kind of keep them out, or we want to, if they do pass the barrier, they have to be faithful and loyal to the African cause. We don't just want anybody walking in, right? And it's the same if you parallel that. Wazungu, this is what Wazungu is doing. So, you know, whereas Kwame Nkrumah is pointing out, yes, you do yes, they're becoming more abstract, becoming less related, so on and so forth. A part of it has to do with the bigger sociological context, the sociological implication that if you do not put a barrier between the lower class and the upper class, then the upper class will become the lower class, and the lower class will become the upper class. You know? And it reminds me, I want to say this. I don't really believe his story. Claude Anderson, he gave a story where he was like, originally, black men weren't even enslaved when they came to America. And they were just free, and they did the indentured servitude, and they were going around, and so on and so forth. But what happened when they were doing the indentured servitude was that after their time was up, they got a house, and they got money, and they got the white women, and white people were like, wait, whoa, right? You know, suddenly they were the politicians, they were this, they were that. They were successful, and they were more successful than white folk because they're intelligent, they're dynamic, they're so on and so forth, right? And white people were like, no, we got to change this, and we got to make it so that they don't have an expiration on their servitude. Now, on their indentured servitude. Now, I'm not saying that's a true story because I understand that's, you know, the enslavement of African people preceded that long before. But it is an interesting story insofar as, realistically speaking, if you do not put up barriers against black people, as the quote, you know, I remember when I was a youngin', was, the quote went something like, if you give an N-word an inch, he'll take an L, right? And the idea was like, why didn't they teach black people to read? It's because if you give them just a little bit, they'll take a lot. And L is like a unit of measurement that was pretty big, I guess, right? Like maybe like more than a foot or something. But the point is, if you know, the reason why you have that barrier is because when you give intelligent and smart and dynamic and worthy people a little bit, they will get a lot from it, you know? And that's and that's something that you do not want if you're trying to keep power over other people. Now, obviously, if as we're trying to develop power for our people, we are supposed to go and give our people the inches. Now that sounds kind of weird, right? Pause. But you get what I'm saying. Some of you dirty. I was gonna tell you, some of you dirty. And I know you say this, man. Ain't nobody listening to you, man. You just. All right. Anyway, so this idea survives today in the notion that logically there are no mysteries. That's So, and this part right here is just that today, now these days, nobody thinks that there's unknowable things. But once upon a time, people did think that. So anyway, empiricism too was, despite its antagonism to rationalism, a reflection of man's conception of his own position in the scheme of things. It too sought to make the limits of what is real coincide with the limits of the human understanding, for it tended to regard what is real exclusively in terms of impressions or in senses. During the European Renaissance, when man gained an increased appreciation of his personal individual dignity and freedom, philosophy responded with disquisitions on the nature of natural rights and connected ideas. Philosophy attempted to provide principles which should inform any political theory if it is to conform to the Renaissance conception of man. Nor had philosophy in this departed from its early character. At every stage between Thales and modern times, philosophy was firmly geared onto what were, for the time being, conceived as primary concerns of life. The history of Greek democracy, for example, must really be traced to Thales. Thales spearheaded two revolutions. The first... By the way, I think there's another person besides from Thales that has the history of Greek democracy. Solon, that's his name, Solon. But anyway, Solon, I remember Solon because I tell you guys about Solon. By the way, look, if you like this commentary, understand this. I want you to understand this. This video is not going to be seen by a lot of people unless you share it, okay? Because it's 4 hours. The other one is 4 hours. It's a long series. This is a pretty damn valuable book, all things considered. Okay, the commentary is pretty damn good. If I can say so myself, right? You got to go out and share it because people are not going to watch it. You got to go do some listening parties. You got to do some watch parties. You got to do something Because Kwame Nkrumah liberates a freaking country, right? He liberates a country, he makes this beautiful land, and the people even there don't even know his literature. Okay? You have, this is a very rare opportunity for you to actually listen to one of Kwame Nkrumah's deepest books being explained to you. And it's and it's being explained so simply that you gotta just share it with somebody. Go do, don't do your Netflix and chill. You do your documentary and chill. Okay? You do your, hey girl, I'm gonna come over and we're gonna watch a video of Consciencism. You know what I'm saying? We're gonna do that. Hey man, I can't. I'm not gonna speak for a girl. But you get what I'm saying. I'm not gonna speak for a lady. But you get what I'm saying. Like, you gotta go out and do it because this is not normal. This is not finna be popping. But it is for us to really grasp a lot of the things that's being said by Kwame Nkrumah and by myself. And if we don't actively propagate our own messaging, it will not be propagated, because I'm telling you, I went to Ghana and the people there do not read Kwame Nkrumah. Okay? But this is probably the easiest damn way that anybody's going to get in contact with Kwame Nkrumah's raw thoughts, and in a context of the 2021 or whatever other year you're going to be listening to this. Let's do it. All right? The history of democracy, so on and so forth. Two spearheaded. The first revolution matured in his attempt to explain nature in terms of nature. So he tried to explain nature in terms of nature. The second revolution consisted in his belief that the unity of nature consisted not in its being, but in its materiality. The social milieu in which Thales lived encouraged him to insist on explaining nature in terms of nature. In Ionia, where he lived, political power was becoming entrenched in the hands of a mercantile class, which had a vested interest in the development of nautical techniques and techniques of production, for it was on such techniques that their prosperity hinged, more so when their society later became more firmly based on slave labor. Now, I want you to just stop right there, okay? All right, I want to stop right there. Listen to me. This is ancient Ionia. Ancient Ionia has a mercantile class with a vested interest in the development of nautical techniques and techniques of production. What this means is that their vested interest in import and export through shipbuilding, right? And making goods and trading and selling goods. I'm telling you this right now. This is like 4,000 years ago. Okay? Maybe not as much. Maybe 3,000 years ago. I don't know. But it's a long time ago, and they are more economically developed and economically ahead than even the Ghana that we're talking about. Because we're not developing and building ships. We have a mercantile class that does not develop and make ships. We have other people controlling the ports of Africa. This is actually shameful. You can't go back to ancient Greece and see something more advanced and just say to yourself, hey, you know what? Even though Oni's reading this book to me, I'm not even going to share it. See what I just told you? You need African people to hear what I just said. I'm mad at this freaking heat. I want to turn it off, but whatever. All right, so the Greeks, as Xenophon confirms in his economics, so he's talking about economics, came to regard mechanical art with contempt. Mechanical arts with contempt, okay? But in Thales' time, individual, including philosophers, depended more on their own productivity for sustenance. Indeed, during one particular good olive harvest, Thales astutely cornered the available olive presses in Miletus and subsequently hired them out at exorbitant rates. Now, if you guys are following my Discord, I did talk about, this is kind of like what the old school way of doing things was you get a workshop, and then from that workshop you could hire it out or rent it out, and so you have olives, and then now you could use the olive press probably to make olive oil, and then you could sell the olive oil or what have you, right? And you sell olive oil for more than you sell olives, because olive oil is a labor-intensive process that people would rather purchase than do on their own. They would rather not just get a bunch of olives and press them themselves. So every time they need olive oil, they'd rather just have olive oil. But if you have the capital, which is the olive press, you can do that. I want to admit to you guys, I did play this Middle Ages video game, I don't want to say the name of it, although I should. But I did play this game, and you do go to the towns and you work and you buy out stuff. It's pretty interesting that white people kind of incorporate their economic knowledge, in a sense, into video games. But I'm going to keep going. All right, for those of you who want to know, I'll just say it. It's like, I wouldn't say it. Forget it. But owing to the change, I mean, if you ask me in the questions, maybe I'll answer it. But just give me a description because I'm not going to remember that. This is like a small tangent. All right. But anyway, owing to the change in the structure of society whereby social political hegemony passed into the hands of the mercantile oligarchy, so owing to the change in the structure of society whereby social political hegemony passed into the hands of the mercantile oligarchy, prosperity no longer depended in a crucial way on the propagation of the gods in connection with agriculture. It depended on commerce with its ancillaries, whereby the Ionian products were marketed along and across the Mediterranean. Right? So again, he's talking about what's it called? Agriculturalism becoming mercantilism. Right? And this is the early stage. Now, I want to tell you this: Africa right now is kind of in a mercantilist state. Okay, and but there's no like mercantile oligarchy per se, and that's going to have its troubles, right? So anyway, there was consequently no need to continue to explain the world by references to the gods. Thales' intellectual predecessors have invoked supernature in order to explain nature. But if the gods were to be explanatory devices for accounting for a phenomenon, then there was nothing to prevent the most vicious inequalities from arising in society. Where gods are used to account for nature, a certain degree of sacerdotal power is inevitable, and where priests have wielded political power, it is not only explanations of natural phenomena which have been bemused with theology. Theological explanations for social phenomena have also been encouraged. With the priest securely installed as the only authorized popularizer of the divine will, the only persons fitted by calling and by grace to expound mystic purposes, social inequalities arise to fortify their exclusive role, and since their power is thought as being rooted in the divine will, it becomes hard to contest. It therefore assumes the form of an authoritarianism which, if unhindered, can come to revel in the most extreme oppression. The history of society in which priests have wielded political power abundantly illustrates this tendency. So, obviously, for those of you who want to get this paragraph from this reading, he's essentially saying that, during an agricultural economy, right, where nature is more so relied on than like your own manufactured work, right, your own hands, you would, at least for this Greek culture, what they would do was that they would give political power to the priests who engage with nature in a supernatural way, right? Because these priests had political power, however, and were not really productive or anything like that, they also, the tendency, he says, is towards authoritarianism. A tendency towards oppression. The tendency is towards people wielding political power abundantly and disproportionate to their own real, actual production. Because, again, especially in Kwame Nkrumah's view of a materialist world, essentially these people are not doing anything. Okay? If you're like dancing to get the rain to come, right? You already, like, if you're in a materialist conception, like if you're in a religious conception or a spiritualist conception, you might say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. He's dancing to make the rain come. He's trying to make the deities happy. And so, you pay them and they have political power and they could curse you and all that kind of stuff. But if you're in a materialist conception, you're like, why the fuck is this person dancing? That's not helping anything. It's not doing anything. And so, so from that position, any sort of political power they have is unwieldy, unwieldy. But of course, it wasn't just, oh yeah, we're dancing and we're getting paid. It was more like, you're going to get cursed and you have to follow me, or we're going to do all that kind of stuff. And, that doesn't really have any sort of positive repercussions, especially from the materialist paradigm. And again, materialist, just for those of you who might not, who might have forgotten from the chapter 1, materialist just means that you see the whole world as a matter of matter, and not necessarily of anything else supernatural about it, right? It's just nature, not a thing. And I want to point out this too, that for ancient Africans, right, or at least for Kemet, they called the supernatural, or what we perceive as what they call the supernatural, they called nature, right? NTR, or nature, right? So it might be that we are, in retrospect, saying, oh yeah, they were talking about the supernatural, when realistically speaking, they might have just been talking about nature. It just might have been science, as we know, you know. But you know, of course, to the Greeks, it's like, damn, they're talking some other stuff, right? Anyway, so let's go. In the particular case of Greek societies, however, certain qualifications need to be made. The early Greeks, without doubt, had a religion. This religion was distinguished by its lack of an established creed. Nevertheless, the Greek priests enjoyed social political power by which they could, among other things, institute action at court on charges of irreligion. This alone was a power which could be translated into political terms even as late as during the trial of Socrates. So basically he's saying, hey, they had political power where they could be like, hey, you know what, you're not religious. And, you know, that could do all sorts of things, all sorts of damage to other people. Let's see, the Greek religion was congregational. This fact, but again, like, this is the thing I don't like about a lot of the quote-unquote Pan-Africanists, is that they really went in on Wazungu, you know? I don't even get it. Like, I don't really care that much about the Greeks. It's interesting. It's interesting, for sure. You know, like I said, I did play a video game that was along the lines of the Middle Ages, so it's not like I'm disinterested, but I wouldn't, like, personally write about it, per se, or this length. I might just drop name drop it, but I wouldn't do it at length. Anyway, but of course it's not me. It's just whatever. I'm just saying, this is one of the things that I would say about the Pan-Africanists, particularly of Kwame Nkrumah's generation, right? But anyway, this Greek translation, the Greek religion was congregational. The fact held consolidated priestly power for when rites are performed communally and not individually, in order that a small farming community should be ensured by the gods against drought and famine. The priest is encouraged to come down heavily on individuals who by their irreligion endanger the community or the state. And this was true with the Greeks. It was as their religion became less congregational and more individual that the power of the priests, already implicitly queried by the new philosophies, diminished significantly. The rise of the mercantile class, with its dependence on mechanical arts rather than religious ritual, tended to reduce the social relevance of the priests and encourage the individualization of Greek religion. It was this growing irreverence of the priests which Thales emphasized by dispensing with the gods altogether as sources of explanations of natural or social phenomena. Thales was able peacefully to spearhead this intellectual revolution, which was itself a reflection of a social revolution, because the Greek priesthood did not, in the strictest sense, form a class. The Greeks, mindful of the massive constricting power which the priesthood could exert if it formed a class, shunned the Oriental example, discouraged life priests, and often fixed the length of time for which one was a priest or priestess. Moreover, the high priesthood was often invested ex officio in the political leader. The above contrast of Greek society with Oriental society, remember, Oriental means East or Eastern, or like basically the Asian countries, right? With Oriental society should not suggest that Greek society was without theocratic manifestation, as it often thought. Greek society had theocratic manifestations which were intensified under Persian rule. The pre-Thales hereditary aristocracy comprising the landowning class converted the ancient clan cults into hereditary priesthoods. To these priesthoods were assigned the power of passing and executing sentence at their discretion, especially on those who were accused of homicide. As private property grew, so did the incentive to homicide on the part of those who wished to ensure that they inherited property. The power of the aristocratic priesthood was based on the belief that those who committed certain crimes infringed the sacred moral order of society, and that they need to expiate their crimes and be absolved if the whole community was not to be thrown into jeopardy. The idea that the whole community was endangered before the gods as a result of certain malpractices of individuals was not abandoned even by Solon, a contemporary of Anaxamander. So again, I talked about Solon before. This is something I want to point out too. Again, like I told you guys, economics precedes culture. Okay? Economics precedes culture, right? So you see that Thales is really getting his grounding from a different economic structure getting its grounding. Okay? Basically, Greece has this agricultural culture, right? Agriculture culture, right? And that agriculture culture has to do with, man and his relationship to nature, and and then there are different people who are like, hey, you know what? Look, if I do a little shimmy, the rain's gonna come, or whatever, or blah blah blah, right? And then they go into this mechanical production kind of mercantile, trade. Hey, you want some juice? I got a wine press. You want some olive oil? I got an olive press. And this is something that we as African people should really have done already. But not to say that we haven't done it already, but I'm saying we should be doing it right now, right? Either way, when that comes about, what happens is that you're no longer in these farming communities, right? that need these priests, you're kind of just working at the mill, you know? You're working at the mill and you're doing so on and so forth. You're not really necessarily living with the land, living with the community. You are, like, you're not really worried about droughts per se. So now the religion itself, the culture itself is now going to individualize that that belief system that you have. And so, you know, it does really speak to, you know, how a lot of us, like I said in the other podcast. So this is a podcast I had about African culture. You guys should go check it out. But it really speaks to that that class. I mean, sorry, that lecture, in the sense that, you know, a lot of what we associate with African culture, right, is in fact like, it does deal with what is essentially an agricultural culture, you know, and you know, oh, we have community based things and community that and community this, and it's like, well, yeah, when you're living in a community, when your economics is for or towards a community, that's probably what your culture is going to look like. Now, for those of you who remember, I do have a son. This son decides to wake up, and he decides to use the restroom, and so he's calling me to go help him with that. So in that sense, I'm going to go over there and help him with that. In the meantime, here's a commercial.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Pro-Black Perspective on KWAZ Radio.
So that's the one good thing about being in New York. You know, your living space is so small that you can run to the bathroom and run back in a very short time. Right? It's like, you know, like, I don't know, some of y'all outside of New York are like, you know, let me go help my kid with the bathroom, and then you gotta run upstairs and downstairs and all that kind of stuff. Me, I just gotta turn around. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? Anyway, but all right. So let's go. Thales' first revolution, therefore, knocked the bottom out of the theocratic and crypto-theocratic manifestations of Greek society. In destroying the gods as explanatory devices, he neutralized them and undermined the social effectiveness of the aristocratic priesthood. The second revolution consisted in his contention that the unity of nature consisted not in its being, but in its materiality. His choice of one substance for his monism had its roots in mercantilism, in the belief that all goods were exchangeable in terms of a common denominator. Water, the common denominator which Thales chose, fittingly reflected the Ionian dependence on its navy for its mercantilism, the growth of the navy being crucial for Ionian and Mediterranean trade. Now again, what is a navy? Navy is not just the ships that you use to trade, but the ships that you use to fight other ships so that you can secure and safeguard your trade. Remember that trade is probably the most important thing for human beings. Okay, trade is probably one of the most important things for human beings. And every time you go to work, what you're doing is you're trading your time. You're trading your labor for paper money, and you're trading that paper money for food, clothing, shelter, and your consciousness, right? Trade is very important. And so, but you have to protect the trade, and that's what the political structure is all about. I talk about this in the other paper. So remember that economics, politics, then culture, right? But the economics here is that, hey, look, we have a water economy, a water-based economy, right? The politics is, hey, you know what? We're going to develop a navy to defend our water-based economy. And then the culture is, you know what? Maybe freaking everything's water. You know what I'm saying? It's a little bit simplistic, a little bit freaking on the nose. But yeah, that's what we observe, right? And the reason why we observe, and you're not going to see that. You're not going to see that in like a freaking fire, you know, like there's people who are fire-based who are like, hey, look, we, you know, so on and so forth. And if you guys remember, check out the joke. He does talk about the southern cradle, the northern cradle, and he says the northern cradle is fire-based. So it's pretty. So you might be like, hey, that's ridiculous. What kind of economy can you have in fire? And it's like, well, that's the economy of freaking war, and nomads and so on and so forth. But that's like literally what Check on the Joke was saying. All right, but anyway, but the interaction between the alteration of social circumstances and the content of consciousness is not one-sided. For circumstance can be changed by revolution, and revolutions are brought about by men who think as men of action and act as men of thought. It is true that revolutionaries are produced by historical circumstances. At the same time, they are not chaff. Hold on a second, let me double check that you guys can hear me. Yeah, all right. I'm sorry, I was traumatized from last time. Like you just don't want to be talking, and then you're not heard, and you're just like worried about it. All right, by historical circumstances, at the same time, they are not chaff before the wind of change, but have a solid ideological basis. Revolution has two aspects. Okay, revolution is a revolution against an old order, and it is also a contest for a new order. Now, understand that. I want you guys to remember that. You have to be against an old order, and you have to be for a new order. Okay? This is why Malcolm X would tell you, get the word revolution out of your mouth. Right? Because, one, a lot of people are not against the old order. I mean, if you are against the old order, that's fine. But you're not really for contesting, let alone for a new order. And like, especially if you're in the Western world, you have to realize that you're the minority there. You're the minority there, and it's very unlikely there's going to be a new order where you are in power. You know, and who else said that? Carter G. Woodson told you that. He said, hey, look, no matter what happens, whoever's going to come into power next, you're still not going to be in power. Now here's the difference. In Africa, you're the majority. And what a majority. So just remember that. And that's why I say I appreciate Kwame Nkrumah for that. He goes back home, and he does like that revolution. Like, so you gotta appreciate him for that. The Marxist emphasis on the determining force of the material circumstance of life is correct, but I would like to give great emphasis to the determining power of ideology. Revolutionary ideology is not merely negative. It is not a mere conceptual refutation of a dying social order, but a positive creative theory, the guiding light of the emerging social order. This is confirmed by the letter from Engels quoted on the motto page of this book. So he's like the letter from Engels about... so the letter from before. Focus on that. You can't just be negative. You can't just be like, man, the police are just beating us up. Or defund the police. You can't just do that. You have to, if you're really talking about a revolutionary ideology, it has to be a positive creative theory, a guiding light for an emerging social order. Back when I was young, I used to read, when I had my, if you guys read the Pro-Black Companion, you're going to see that I have quotes in it. Now, one of these quotes I did remove, but I want to read it here because it's in my collected thing. But it's like, it's Margaret Walker. She says, let a new earth rise, let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Right? That's what it is. You have to, this is why I say, you have to have a positive creative theory. One of the things I do in the book Power is I say, look, this is how we can have Africa. We can have Africa having a positive creative theory. This is why I left, I didn't physically leave America yet, but I mentally left America. I spiritually left America. Why did I mentally and spiritually leave America? Because I understand that a positive creative theory is going to have to be practiced on our continent. Or maybe even the Caribbean. But it's not going to be practiced where I'm the minority. Okay? You have to have you can't just be merely negative. And, shout out to, appreciate Nkrumah for that. Anyway, so not only is it significant that Thales should have chosen water as the fundamental substance, but the fact that he maintained at all that everything was derived from one and the same substance was of great importance. For by maintaining this, he was implying the fundamental identity of man as well. Man, according to him, being not half natural, half supernatural, but wholly natural. That is to say, on the social plane, his metaphysical principles amounted to an assertion of the fundamental equality and brotherhood of men. Nevertheless, his philosophy only supported the revolution, which was in a sense bourgeois. The assertion of the fundamental equality and brotherhood of man does not automatically issue in socialism, for it does not amount to the assertion of social equality. Indeed, Thales' specification of a form of matter as a basic naturally places a premium on water, and in the social plane remains compatible with a class structure. His philosophy therefore only supported a sort of bourgeois democratic revolution and not a socialist one. So of course this is just, Kwame Nkrumah just telling you, just reminding you he's a socialist first. Like, without any real due cause, because, but it's just like you just gotta read this and be like, oh yeah, he's a socialist. But like that's the thing that people would consciously do. Like even if I'm doing a writing, right, I'm gonna just insert. By the way, I'm a black nationalist. You know what I mean? Like you gotta do that. Like that's just a thing about writing. Some of you, when you write your books, some of you who write your books, you know that you sometimes just gotta talk to the audience, right? You got to let the audience know that you're there, right? On the only recorded opportunity which Thales had of translating his metaphysics into politics, he firmly urged unity of the balkanized Ionian states. This was hardly surprising, as he had asserted the unity of nature. The Ionians paid scant heed to him, and they were duly undone. The point which I am anxious to make is not merely that the earliest philosophies, and you see, unity between balkanized people, and when they do not unify, they are duly undone. He's like, again, that's Pan-Africanism. We're talking about uniting with our brothers and sisters because otherwise there are other people who will wipe us out, like they did the Australian, like they did the Amerindian, and like they almost did with our ancestors already, right? The point which I am anxious to make is not merely that the earliest philosophies carried implications of a political and social nature, and so were warmly connected with the actualities of life. I am suggesting that these philosophies were reflections of social currents, and that they arose from social exigencies. Thus, Thales' philosophy needed, if it was to destroy the allegedly heaven-sanctioned aristocratic society, to assert the irrelevance of a pantheon, and this he did in his attempt to bring all explanation of nature within the ambit of nature itself. Revolutionary, as opposed to a reformist attenuation of clerical influence, called not for an humiliation. Yeah, I know, right? Shaking my damn head. Thus, Thales' philosophy needed, he wanted to destroy the alleged heaven-sanctioned aristocratic society to assert the irrelevance of a pantheon, and this he did in his attempt to bring all explanation of nature within the ambit of nature itself, right? Again, you have to destroy the pantheon if you wanted to get rid of the priesthood, right? Destroy say the pantheon, the religious pantheon is irrelevant, and then you could say the priests are irrelevant. Okay, a revolution, as opposed to a reformist attenuation of clerical influence, called not for the humiliation here and there of social inequalities, the smoothing of the sharp corners and the trimming of the eminence, but for a total rejection of the idea of social inequality. That in metaphysics, which implies this rejection of social inequality, is precisely that which is common to all monists, those who assert the unity of nature and of different kinds of things as only different manifestations of the same thing. It was the idea of the unity of nature as well as that of basic equality and justice which required that Thales should generalize those rules of thumb picked up in the marshes of the Nile Delta. Rules of thumb allow for a certain measure of arbitrariness and partiality in application. The rules which the Egyptian arpedonaps used in marking out farms were bound to lead to injustices, for they were measured with knotted pieces of cord. Thales' egalitarian perception necessary for a mercantile economy led him to seek general forms of rules. When rules became general, they guaranteed an objective impartiality, and impartiality is the outward mark of egalitarianism. So I don't know why he just shaded Nile other than Egypt. But basically, right here, what he's saying is that, when the Egyptians were to do measurements, it was not necessarily as fixed as what Thales would later promote. And Thales' promotion of a more fixed kind of measurement or rules or so on and so forth, that could lead to the egalitarianism that Kwame Nkrumah himself would support. So anyway, Thales' successor, Anaximander, reasoned, however, that the unity of nature could not be itself guarantee equality, right, and impartiality. Indeed, Thales himself was bourgeois in his actual political life. In Anaximander's thought, a need was felt for an active social principle which would illuminate and sanction social structure. So again, from this you could also gather that Thales preceded Solon if Anaximander was a contemporary of Solon. Okay, so just for those of you who might be following, I think he's probably gonna talk about Solon later, but he's just giving you a backdrop. He's giving you, again, this whole chapter is just philosophy and society. So he's giving you a backdrop of how philosophy and society had interacted at one point and how they probably were less interactive. How they eventually become less interactive. This is a very well organized essay for what it's worth, right? Let me just double check how long this paragraph. I won't even do it. All right, so Thales' successor, Anaximander, reasoned, however, that the unity of nature could not be itself guarantee equality and impartiality, blah, blah, blah. Thales was bourgeois in his actual political life. In Anaximander's thoughts, a need was felt for an active social principle which would illuminate and sanction social structure. This he called the principle of justice, a groundwork principle which in Alexander's system regulated both social organization and the metaphysical generation of things. In his philosophy, he conceived the stock of neutral material in which nothing was differentiated, a boundless, featureless, eternal expanse whose restlessness separated out the things of this world. These things abide in the world for a time, measured out according to the principles of justice. And at the end of the time, they give way to other things and flow back where they came, back into the boundless neutral stock. So whereas at first blush, Anaximander seemed to have diverged widely from Thales, his master and friend, he in fact only tried to secure similar social objectives by means of conceptual instruments not too different from those of Thales. The early Greek philosophers had a social moral preoccupation which they expressed in terms of metaphysics. It was this social moral preoccupation which made them continual sufferers of political persecution, right? So again, he's just saying that Anaximander had like this kind of noon-like idea, right? And remember that these people probably, all of them studied in ancient Egypt, came out and were like, wow, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm going to talk about something. And, breaking the whole mysteries code, which is to not really talk about stuff, but they did it, and, that's what it has. So the point I wish to underline in this respect is that the priests had grounded their power in all manner of social hierarchy in their supernatural account of the world. To destroy sacerdotal power and its associated arbitrary social structure was necessary to remove their groundings. It was necessary to give a natural account of the world. In this way, philosophy served as an instrument of social justice. So he's saying philosophy served as an instrument of social justice. However, revolutionary were the monists, that is to say, those who claimed that everything was at bottom the same thing, right? That was still bogged down once they had claimed the fundamental equality of all. It is possible, admittedly, to regard Anaximander as having had an awareness of this stagnation, for he envisaged not a static and immobile social equality, but a social equality pursued at all times by the active principle of justice. Anaximander was not a lotus eater. He could not allow society to remain dormant, complacent with the social structure which was current in his time. His principle of justice was one which called for social change, for he could not see an egalitarian society as one which everything was permanently as it was, in which inequalities remained undisturbed. It fell to Heraclitus to introduce the notion of growth into the conception of society. Now, I just want to go back up. He's really focusing on Greece, really focusing on the nuances of Greece. Again, like I said, you can see the stuff in Egypt. This whole idea of justice, the principle of justice, active principle of justice, going through everything. Ma'at. That was Ma'at. So, I want you guys to understand this, right? You could easily tell the same thing. The whole formless, boundless, original matter, Noon. From Noon, you have Ra and Ma'at working to create the universe. Okay? But Ma'at is there. Ma'at is present at the creation of the universe. And so Ma'at, the sense of, this justice that African people had, the morals, the ethics, this was there from the creation of the universe. So again, Anaximander could be sitting down in a class, listening to African people teach these lessons, reluctantly to foreigners. And then he comes out after 12, 30 years, whatever, how many years he was there, and he would be like, I think fundamentally there's nature, there's justice in the world. And then fast forward to today, we're reading about him and we're like, damn, that's deep, But realistically speaking, it's just bastardization or inferior product to what he would have learned in ancient Egypt. And so it does give us insight into what you could learn in ancient Egypt, obviously. But it's obviously, obviously if if I were to do this, I would just go to ancient Egypt. I would just focus on ancient Egyptian literature. But, obviously you can't do that, right? So the preceding early Greek philosophers were so bent on destroying the foundation of priestly aristocratic power that they paid little attention to social growth. They were so wrapped in their purposes that they also jibbed at the immortality of the soul. Socrates being the first Greek philosopher to make the immortality of the soul a tenet of philosophy as distinct from a belief of religion. According to Heraclitus, too, all things are one, but fire, the fundamental thing suffers transformations into other things, there is a permanent potential of instability in everything, and in this instability, which makes transformation possible, objects are only deceptively serene. They are all delicate balances of opposing forces. This opposition of forces is conceived by Heraclitus to be so fundamental that without it, everything would pass away. An object is an attunement of opposite tensions, and without the tension, there can be no object. Social laws, too, are conceived by Heraclitus after the same manner. He conceives them as an attunement of tensions, the resultant of opposing tendencies. Without the opposing tendencies, there could be no laws. It can be seen that Heraclitus conceives society as a dynamicism, in which out of the strife of opposites there emerges an attunement. Heraclitus makes this strife of opposites indispensable to growth and creation, both in nature and in society. Sorry, I'm just getting kind of hungry. I'm not gonna trip. Let me see how long this chapter is. So you see it says society and philosophy. Oh damn, this is long. Okay, so it goes up to page 56. All right, and we're just like on page 35 or something like that. Socialism, democracy. I think that's where we were, right? Yeah, social laws too. Yeah. I'm so hungry. All right, I gotta eat before I do my recording. I just like what. The thing is this: I've been waking up pretty early. Okay, I've been waking up pretty early. Like ever since I traveled back. I don't know why. Partly because I'm sick. Partly because I'm sick of America. But but you know, it is what it is, right? But fire, the fundamental thing, suffers transformation into other things. There's a permanent political instability in everything. And in this instability, which makes transformation possible, objects are only deceptively serene. They are all delicate balances of opposing forces. This opposition of forces is conceived by Heraclitus to be so fundamental that without it, everything would pass away. An object is an attunement of opposite tensions, and without the tensions, there could be no object. Now I should just read this quickly because just like the first paragraph, you kind of pick up on that Kwame Nkrumah was doing a very well-organized essay. And well-organized essays, what they do is that they kind of give you a lot of back history before they get to the freaking main point. So in the last one, we heard about the big development of philosophy, but it was all to kind of bring you to materialist philosophy. You know, this chapter you kind of already pick up on. It's going to be about making sure that philosophy is relevant to society. And it's giving you now the backdrop of philosophy being relevant to society. So it's not really that important. Whether, like, what Heraclitus believed and what Thales believed isn't really so fundamental to what Kwame Nkrumah was trying to say. So it's realistically speaking, we don't really have to, like, explain and understand everything. I mean, I would do that only because I imagine that you want to understand and explain everything. But realistically speaking, like, if I just seem to read over it, it's only because I understand, like you understand, or we both understand that it's not that important. Not even to Kwame Nkrumah. You pick up on this from chapter 1, right? The social law twos are conceived by Heraclitus as of the same matter. He conceives them as an attunement of tensions, the resultant of opposing tendencies. Without the opposing tendencies, there could be no laws. So laws are a matter of opposing tendencies. It can be seen that Heraclitus conceives society as a dynamicism in which, out of the strife of opposites, there emerges an attunement. Heraclitus makes the strife of opposites indispensable to growth and creation, both in nature and in society. And growth or creation is nothing but the attunement or balance which emerges from a strife of opposites. In social terms, this means that society is permanently in revolution, and that revolution is indispensable to social growth and progress. Evolution by revolution is the Heraclitean touchstone of progress. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, this is dialectical materialism. This is Hegelian dialectics, the idea that you have you have thesis, antithesis, and they engage to make a synthesis, right? So thesis and antithesis come against each other, and when they clash, in a sense, they become a synthesis. Now, I want to also put out this one, that in ancient Kemet, so there's this document called, they're like Kemet self-knowledge and cosmic wisdom quotations, and they might not be direct quotations, but basically there's this white boy who went into the ancient temples, and he studied the walls, and he came out with certain conclusions as to what was written on the walls, or what were the belief systems of the ancient Kemets. And one of the ways that he expressed that was he said that one of the quotes that they had, but he made into a bunch of quotes in Proverbs, and one of the quotes is, "A phenomenon always arises from the interaction of complementary. If you want something, look for the complement that will elicit it. Set causes Horus, and Horus redeems Set." So what he's saying is that, or what the ancients were saying, if you will, is that things come about through the interaction of complementarity, right? And so this is the same thing as the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the Hegelian dialectic, and it's the same thing as what Heraclitus is saying, the strife of opposites interact and then they become their own attunement. Evolution through revolution is what he's saying. But of course, they don't say it as well as our ancestors have. But of course, that also tells us that we have to go and see what our ancestors had said, because again, the quote that I just read was just some white boy. It was actually a summary of what some white boy had written in his summary of what he had read. So we have to, like, one of the most important things for us as African people is to go back and find out what. Like, just read the freaking walls. Just read the walls that they left in stone. The messages they left in stone for us. All right, so the idea of the cosmic strife of opposites came to be impressed on Heraclitus by the eruptions which shook Greek society. After the aristocrats had overthrown the monarchies, Greek colonies came to be established on the lips of the Mediterranean basin. With this and the introduction of coinage, the value of landed property as an instrument of economic transactions declined. Trade became more widespread, and development of a merchant navy to assist the spread of trade further depressed the economic significance of the landed aristocracy. Basically, once upon a time, you had land, and you were the most valuable people in the society because you had a bunch of land. People needed to live off the land. Now, people can live off the water, off the navy. People can live off the land. They can live through trading with people in other parts of the world. They can live through trading with people in Persia. They can live with trading with people in Kemet. They can live with so on and so forth. And so now if you were the landed aristocracy, then you're really not that important anymore, because you're no longer you're not longer the decider whether somebody lives or dies, because nobody really needs you. And so eventually, of course, when you have that wealth, you have the big navy, you have the big navy, whatever, you come to the landed aristocracy who has this little army, and you take them over, right? Because you can pay for mercenaries and all that kind of stuff, and that's revolution, realistically speaking. But again, like I said, it really comes back down to economics, and this is why one of the issues inside of Africa is that we don't have that economic independence. And so I'm actually grateful again that I'm able to read this book, and hopefully I can articulate this in a future book, and hopefully you go and get that book, and read it, But anyway, trade becomes more widespread, and the development of the merchant navy to assist the spread of the trade further depressed the economic significance of the landed aristocracy. The new merchant force began to seek political prizes from the decadent aristocracy. This fundamental social change, initiated by economic drives, coupled with the opposition of local forces to Persian rule in the Asia Minor states, created among the Greeks a society which was comparatively redeemed. Even the 30 tyrants marked a redemption of Greek society. Redemption could not, however, mean a society languishing in drugged serenity. Internal dissensions persisted on all sides. Society was twisted by swift change, but always out of a melee there emerged, in course of time, a discernible pattern. Strife and an emergent pattern, seeming attunement, which served as a resting point until contending forces should once again become pronouncedly factious. This seesaw, this sweltering social environment, gave birth in the mind of Heraclitus to the idea that the universe itself is an attunement of forces perpetually in strife. From that moment, the idea of finite history was killed, and that of dialectic of history born. So you kind of see, like I said, he's really just getting up to the Hegelian dialectic. I could probably even just skip ahead and you'll see that he talks about Hegelian dialectic, but we'll get to it later, right? But it's a pretty good background for Hegelian dialectic, I mean, I'm familiar with Hegelian dialectic. I'm not really familiar with the background, so, this is pretty good, right? In the examples chosen, I have tried to illustrate the way in which early materialist philosophy of a monist kind is suggested by social phenomena, and in turn inspires social phenomena and policy. I can perhaps illustrate the way in which idealist philosophy serves the same function by citing the philosophy of Anaxagoras. In this philosophy, the diverse things of the universe were said to arise from seeds. These seeds are the things that were conceived after such a fashion that they represented minute universes. Each seed, in fact, contains the whole range of diversity in the macrocosmic universe. Each specific object was nothing but an accretion of seeds. The whole agglomeration of seeds constituting the universe was said by Anaxagoras to have an external principle of motion. Naturally, a principle of motion was required to regulate the quantity of seeds involved in each object, and this was to be the source of the difference between things. And this principle of motion was for Anaxagoras an intellectualist one. He called it nous, reason, mind. Anaxagoras, too, can be exhibited as supporting an egalitarianism. Indeed, his theory of the unity of nature is in certain respects a more rigorous and closed one than that of the monist. He did not affirm a mere identity of basic makeup. He put forward a theory of the participation of any one kind of object in every other kind of object. In his philosophy, nature was more firmly united than in any other philosophy. This distinction between his view and that of the monist, if given social expression, becomes the distinction between socialism and democracy. Whereas in democracy it is sufficient to affirm a mere egalitarianism, in socialism it is necessary to affirm a convertible involvement of each in all. In other words, whereas the monist in social terms sought to transform an oligarchic society into a democratic one, Anaxagoras sought to transform a democratic one into a socialist society. So you kind of see what he's saying, right? Indeed, once Anaxagoras had emphasized socialist responsibility of each for all and all for each, the next step was to emphasize the intrinsic worth of the individual. Thus, a social progressive movement, which started with the supervention of a people over a class, ended with the separating out the cult of individuals. It was left to the sophists to achieve this. This phase was given its most definitive utterance in the Protagorean statement that man is the measure of all things. The universe had passed from the hands of the gods into the hands of man. This Protagorean view, which was a passionate testimony to the new place of man in the scheme of things, was quickly perverted by lesser minds into a grasping idealistic subjectivism. In this transformed form, it was claimed that the reality was a replica of the subjective will. Indeed, it was in this form that Socrates criticized it. And so you see, he's going over the debates that Socrates had with Protagoreans and Sophists and so on and so forth. But just to clarify, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, he's discussing this quote-unquote socialism, this quote-unquote idea of the intrinsic worth of individuals, and pointing out that society would be like from an intellectual standpoint, the Greeks were more concerned with, or some Greeks were concerned with creating like a socialist utopia, right? That values men more than a society that would value gods, and in so doing value people and hierarchies and oppression in a sense, right? So anyway, so the universe had passed from the hands of and so forth. In this transformed form, it was a claim that. And so I want to say this too. I kind of agree that I probably shouldn't stream this live because some people might want to rewind. Some people might want to, it might be a little bit complicated for some people. So it would be good for them to be able to pause, to be able to read, to be able to, scratch their head or what have you. It'd be good for you guys to take a break too. I'm standing. How if you guys saw me record, I stand the entire time. So I could do that, but. That's just me, right? Some of you guys got other things to do. The phrase was given to its most definitive utterance in the Protagorean statement that man is the measure of all things. The universe is passed from the hands of the gods into the hands of men. This Protagorean view, Socrates criticized it. It was necessary to destroy this idealistic subjectivism first because it was but a short step from its solipsism, the view that only oneself exists and other things exist as one's experience, and second, because the addition to damaging the possibility of science and the public and objective grounding of truth, it undermined the foundations of society, for it made social reality too depend upon the subjective will. The original attempts to redeem society by giving it a united foundation by asserting the unity and brotherhood of man now promised to destroy the society which it had set out to save. Egalitarianism desperately needed to be distinguished from anarchism, for anarchism is the political expression of subjective idealism, right? So the idea is that you don't want it to be an immoral society, right? Anarchy would be like, hey, look, everybody's right. Everybody's right. And so you don't want everybody to be right because when somebody, let's say somebody attacks your relative, right? And they'll be like, well, I was horny or whatever, right? And you're like, hey, I'm right because I'm, it's my body, my feelings. My body had an urge. No. You know what I'm saying? Right? Like, no, that's anarchy. That's not what people want. That's not, you don't want to agree with that. You'd rather some sort of ethical framework. You'd rather you'd rather something like that. And that's really, the big difference. So Socrates consequently made it his duty to destroy this form of the Protagorean maxim. Or like I'll give an example that, is a little more innocent. right? If it's done. Socrates consequently made his duty to destroy this form of the Protagoras maxim. His social aim in seeking this destruction was to restore the objectivity of society. Socrates, too, was a firm theoretical believer in egalitarianism. He exemplified this in his whole life by his unwavering contempt for pomp, circumstance, and humbug. He has left us an undying testimony of his egalitarian belief in his use of the slave boy and the Meno. In his Platonic dialogue, Socrates tried to prove the disincarnate existence of the soul and the innateness of certain ideas of mathematics and ethics. In selecting a slave boy for the purpose of his proof, he showed that he held a belief in the common and equal nature of man. This belief activates Socrates' whole philosophy. He believed in the equal endowment of all with innate ideas, the equal ability of all to lead a good life. Knowledge, he said, was virtue, and knowledge, he further held, was innate learning, being in fact a way of remembering which was already engraved upon the individual soul. Though in the Meno, Socrates put forward a fundamental egalitarianism, would not be pretended that egalitarianism was to be found among the established facts of life. The reason for this discrepancy between truth and social fact was conceived by him in moral terms. If people were not conceited, mistaking their ignorance for knowledge, and if they reflected, they would all be equally moral, both because virtue is knowledge and because they would fundamentally all have the same knowledge as suggested in the Meno. It has not been my purpose to argue that all the early precursors of our modern philosophers in trying to modify or support a modification of society conceived this in terms of egalitarianism. But even when they pursued a social line in reaction to the egalitarian line, they were still responding to social urges and cultural conditions. In genuine sense, their philosophies were intellectual reflections of contemporary social conditions. So what he's saying is this, look, he's like, hey, I'm giving you a bunch of these philosophers. Oh, look, it says the Republic later on, right? But anyway, I'll give you a bunch of philosophers, and look, all these philosophers were egalitarian, but I'm not trying to show you that. What I'm really, don't be mistaken that these were people were egalitarian. And, my thing is this, Wazungu is not egalitarian at all, right? You know what I'm saying? But, it is what it is, right? Well, what he's saying is, don't be mistaken from that. What he's trying to demonstrate, the reason for this, come back to the main topic, right? Don't come from this and say, oh, Wazungu is really egalitarian. That's not the point. That's not true, and it's not the point. What he's showing you is that the philosophers were relevant to the contemporary society, unlike the philosophers of today, right? With, of course, Kwame Nkrumah is going to do the exception because what he's doing is he's doing Consciencism, which is the philosophy and ideology of decolonization, all right? But anyway, so one example of an early philosopher who became reactionary in respect to the egalitarian development was Plato. Socrates' judges and executioners were not half as cruel to him as was his betrayer, Plato, also his loving disciple. So I'm actually pretty interested in this. I didn't know that... Actually, no, Plato writes the Republic, which is obviously hierarchical. But, it is what it is. Whereas Socrates had affirmed the original equal endowment of men and explained differences between men in terms of education, Plato was no believer in the fundamental equality of man. He held to the original inequality of men, which an unrelenting educational system would quickly reveal. Right? And, I actually, like I said, I agree with what Plato was saying in a sense. It's 50-50, right? Right, it's 50-50. But let me say something. It was reactionary in respect to Socrates, judges, and executioners were not half as cruel as Plato. Which is interesting because Plato's the one who records Socrates' speeches. Some people actually have the opinion that Socrates might not have been real and it just might be made up by Plato. But there's also people that are like, yeah, I saw Socrates myself, So it's, but like a lot of what we know from Plato, from Socrates is what Plato wrote. But anyway, let's get going though. So it's kind of like, why is he the cruel betrayer if he's like legit the person who preserves him, kind of. But anyway, he held that some men had a higher reason than others, and though education might up to a point conceal them, the differences were bound to reveal themselves after a certain stage of a thoroughgoing education. These differences in the level of intelligence, according to Plato, implied a natural division and hierarchy of labor, each man being fitted by nature for functions appropriate to him, the less intelligent being in fact only qualified to undertake menial forms of labor. All political and social power was at the same time to be concentrated in the hands of the intellectuals and trust. In this way, Plato adumbrated an unconscionable totalitarianism of intellectuals. Now again, this unconscionable totalitarianism of intellectualism was what Kemet was. You know what I mean? What, you had to go to school for like 40 years and then you could be a priest. And the priest did everything, did all the big work. you know. And the thing is this, that I'm not completely, like, again, you know, this is the distinction between Kenesu and Kemet model. And we discussed this. I think I actually have a recording of that particular essay in regards to the proof of the law of Ma'at, right? We discussed this in that where, realistically speaking, yes, you have these hierarchies, but the hierarchies are not, are just how man works, man functions, you know, particularly in like mixed societies, you know. But again, it's just what you would do. And you know, you might, you know, like if you're like Nkrumah, you might be like, hey, you know what, I like socialism, I like egalitarianism. But you know, and I mean I also agree that, hey, you know, maybe everybody could be a surgeon, you know, maybe, but I'm not 100% sure that everybody can be a surgeon, you know. And then here's the thing: when I say that mixed societies, like, I'm also well aware that if you were to, like, let's say if you were to go to a 12th grade class today, right, that it's very likely, it's very unlikely that everybody would be qualified for a surgeon. Now, maybe if you were to, from birth, you know, develop people towards that, maybe, right? So that's why I said I'm a 50-50, right? But then that's also like a question of, would you develop people from birth to do that kind of stuff, you know? And then there's also the other aspect, which is, you know, realistically speaking, are there people more suited towards other things? Now, I don't go into this whole, you know, whether or not people are suited for anything, because I believe that we're just, you know, we're just animals, you know, with a big head. You know what I mean? But at the same time, I do recognize that, you know, like, for instance, when I see my son, I could probably see, like, I could see somebody who's physically active and has his, you know, like, I could look at his intelligence as different from the intelligence of other children, you know. And I think other parents, like parents with multiple children, could also see different personality quirks or different personalities among their children, different intelligence, you know, particular intelligence, not like a neutral intelligence, but like a particular intelligence. Like maybe somebody's more mechanical, maybe somebody's more creative, maybe somebody's so forth. And maybe that has to do with their nurture, but it's possible, very possible, that it also has to do with their nature. So I don't necessarily dismiss it. So I say, like, it could be hierarchy, it could be egalitarian, who knows, right? But at the end of the day, also, if you're going to do a social organization, you want it to be hierarchical. You want it to be hierarchical. And that's just because at some point when you're doing mass action, you have to organize it from, you know, from a limited amount of organizers, you know, and that's just what it's going to be. Now again, like I said, there's the Kenesu model, which if you really, like, again, like, it's complicated. You'd want to, let's just go into the book, right? So anyway, but you know, if you really want to know, like I said, go to the Book of Power, and you could read about that all the time, right? So anyway, not even this could exhaust Plato's anti-egalitarianism. He looked for ways in which the lopsided group of intellectuals might harden into a class. He found a solution in some form of eugenics. Women and men were to be mated according to his principles of eugenics, and thus there would be a created succession based on birth of people who would in perpetuity hold all power and trust. Okay, right? But you know, you get it. You know, of course, he's just going to be going against Plato because he's not for the hierarchy thing. But I think hierarchies are how most, like, it's the Kemet model, and Kemet is the basis of most kingdoms and civilizations of today, you know? But anyway, it must be said that Plato was, especially the Western societies, and it must be said that Plato was profoundly upset by the turn which Athenian democracy had taken. In particular, he could not forgive a system which made it possible for his master, Socrates, to be executed. In pursuit of his private vendetta, he elaborated the principles of the Republic. In this, however, he seriously betrayed Socrates, for Socrates himself had acknowledged the political system is virtuously refusing to flee from it when accorded the opportunity of doing so. So Plato acknowledged the political system. Yeah, so Plato liked the political system, notwithstanding the fact that it killed him. And Plato was like, Socrates liked the political system, notwithstanding the fact that it killed him. Whereas Plato was like, no, you killed this person. I don't think this is a worthy political system. And you know, I mean, like this is the same contention that we have today, where we're like, is democracy worth it compared to, and not necessarily totalitarianism, but you know, compared to like a virtuous leader. And this is what Socrates is talking about. Like, if you had a virtuous leader, if you had virtuous leadership, would you really want to rather have, superstitious masses or of virtuous and informed leadership. And Kemet was like, yeah, let's have a virtuous, informed leadership. Anyway, but like the thing with the exception that Kennesu had, which was, and this is like Ethiopia, right? But the exception that Kennesu had was that it wasn't a superstitious masses; it was a well-informed masses. And so if you had a well-informed masses, sure, you would want to have democracy. But when you don't have a well-informed masses, then you do want well-informed leadership, notwithstanding. Anyway, I hope you guys could hear me. Testing. Okay, I know this is tough. All right, so the Republic in this society, hey, betrayed Socrates for Socrates himself, and now as well, blah, refusing to do so. I do not wish in saying that Plato betrayed Socrates by assailing the Athenian democracy to suggest that the Athenian democracy was a full democracy. The Greek democracy as a whole, but especially the Athenian, never embraced all resident adults, nor did it aim, even as an ideal, at the redistribution of wealth. Women were not included under the provisions of the democratic constitution, and the aristocrats and merchant class continued to depend for their wealth on slave and other exploited labor. It was indeed due to the availability of slave labor that the free citizenry was not as oppressed as they might have been. The citizenry were expected to remain content with the fact that certain offices or states were filled by lot, and average citizens were able to become judges and executives. Right? So he's just saying, yeah, even though I'm talking about democracy as Athens, it's not really democracy. And it's not to say this is not democracy. It's not to say this is not democracy. To have enslaved people is not to say it's not democracy. To not have redistributed wealth is not to say it's not democracy. Because democracy, essentially this critique of democracy here is not really a critique of democracy. Because if people voted for this, then that's what it was. Like, that's what they will get. Now, obviously, technically, you might be like, well, this provision right here, not all resident adults, but even that is questionable, because if the adults do vote for not having, let's say women vote, that would be democracy in a sense, right? And I do want to go to this thought, because it's pretty interesting, because I never really heard any black person go against democracy or against women's suffrage, except for I did hear Kelly Miller say it. And so Kelly Miller, if you look into, let's say African American history, when you look at African history in America, right, you have Kelly Miller, who was a contemporary of Martin Delany and Frederick Douglass, right? So sometimes we tend to dichotomize history and be like Frederick Douglass or Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass or Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass or Martin Delany, right? And it's like we just leave out the other people there. So Kelly Miller was one of them. Kelly Miller has this really popular quote that I like, which was along the lines of, the black people pay for what they want and beg for what they need, right? But and he says from the white man, right? But beyond that, Kelly Miller also said, yeah, he doesn't think that women should vote, because he believes that men should vote for the interests of their family, and that instead of women voting for women's interests and men voting for men's interests, that somebody from the family, which would be the man, should vote in the interest of his whole family. And so every family should have a vote, and not so much every person should have a vote. So again, there's different ways to look at democracy, not necessarily as every person having a vote, or maybe every family has a vote. Or even in America, what it was that every household had a vote. Like if you were a man with land, then you had a vote, because so on and so forth. And that's not necessarily what we consider as democracy, but it is, like, I would say that you could say it's a form of democracy, even though we would critique it today as not being a form. But it makes a lot of sense for everybody with a home, for instance, to have a vote. In the sense that, let's say I go to Ghana, right, and I don't own any property. I don't own a home. I'm just a visitor. I'm just a tourist. I'm a person, though. Should I vote there? No. I'm not a citizen. But I'm not a citizen, not just I'm not a citizen, but everybody understands that I'm not a citizen. But even if I were a citizen and I just didn't have any land, I didn't have any home, why should I vote if the particularly like in a society where the taxes are based off of land, right? If I'm not even contributing to the taxes per se, if I'm not even contributing to or to the real cost of living, there's a lot to understand. Instead of us looking at the history or looking at the past from our modern eyes, we have to look at it from the perspective of, well, if land were the main wealth generator and you were not a part of the land, then why do you have a vote equal to the people with the land? You know, like what exactly are you like why are you dealing with the budget and budgetary concerns? You know, because clearly, right? Anyway, so let's but that's just me just kind of extrapolate and just tell you some more stuff while we're reading to this thing. So there's one other interesting aspect of Plato's betrayal. Philosophy has its own sociology. And it's not surprising that Plato failed to make a certain appropriate distinction. Faced with one, for him, unpleasant effect of the Greek democracy, he failed to draw a distinction between the theory of democracy and its practice in Athens. Theory and practice are always connected, but not always in the way which Plato thought. While each social system has supporting ideology, revolutionary ideology seeks to introduce a new system. Introduce a new social system. It is besides common for practice to fall short of the demands of theory. Democracy could not, therefore, be made to stand or fall with Athenian society. Plato failed grotesquely to separate a condemnation of the Athenian political practice from a condemnation of the Mercantic theory. But Plato was himself too much a reactionary ever to have been content with simply criticizing, even condemning, the Athenian misrepresentation of democracy. So, so what Plato, so what he's saying is this, right? Athenian democracy was not really democracy, but Plato critiqued democracy through critiquing Athenian democracy, right? But because, so I think this is not a great point from Nkrumah. I believe Nkrumah is kind of kind of a little bit contradicting what he said earlier about how philosophies are supposed to deal with the actual practices around them. And so if Plato is actually dealing with the actual practice around him, then him not critiquing the theory that's not really being applied anywhere doesn't really make any sense. And again, one of the things that people understand from at least our day and age is that the Athenian democracy was the full gamut of democracy, as far as anybody would know, because a lot of people are considering considering the idea that Athenian democracy was the original democracy. So if Plato were critiquing Athenian democracy, he was in fact critiquing all democracy in the world. Right? As far as what the historical record is suggesting. So it's not really. I don't think this is a fair critique, and particularly in light of what Nkrumah was saying earlier about what we were saying earlier about democracy, earlier about philosophy having to be should be related to society. So I'm going to read that again just so that you guys get it in this kind of context, right? So it says, there is one other interesting aspect of Plato's betrayal. Philosophy has its own sociology, and it's not surprising that Plato failed to make a certain appropriate distinction. Faced with one, for him, unpleasant effect of the Greek democracy, he failed to draw a distinction between the theory of democracy and its practice in Athens. So again, he shouldn't actually, it's not a failure, because one, he should be critiquing the practice, and two, the theory of democracy was the practice as far as this country, as far as the world was concerned at that point. There wasn't a British democracy, there wasn't a French democracy, there wasn't an American democracy at the point of Plato, right? There was only a Greek democracy. There wasn't multiple different democracies to compare and contrast. There was only the Greek democracy, right? So theory and practice are always connected, but not always in this way which Plato thought. While each social system has supporting ideology, a revolutionary ideology seeks to introduce a new social system. It is besides common for practice to fall short of the demands of theory. Democracy could not therefore be made to stand or fall with Athenian society. Plato failed grotesquely to separate a condemnation of the Athenian political philosophy practice from the condemnation of democratic theory. So again, this is actually not a fair comparison. It's like all right, Ujama, right? Ujama, it's like if Nyerere in 1960, let's just make a number, I don't know off the top of my head, but let's say 1964, Nyerere is doing Ujama, he begins and starts Ujama, right? If somebody's writing about a critique of Ujama, they have to critique what Nyerere is doing, right? They have to critique what Nyerere is doing. If they're saying, hey, look, Ujama's good, but what Nyerere is doing isn't good, then they're kind of remove themselves from reality. And it's not, now 200 years later, if there's a bunch of different types of Ujamaa, then sure, you could be like, Nyere's version of Ujamaa was not that good, and critiquing, whatever. But the reality is that, as far as the historical record is, this quote unquote democracy as an idea was in fact Athenian society. So to critique democracy, you had to critique Athenian society, and if you didn't do that, like, it's not a failure. That's what I'm saying. So it's actually pretty interesting that, like I said, man, you guys are, whoever is listening this far, I know it's like nobody's listening this far, right? Or if you are, just drop a comment. But whoever's listening this far, you're pretty damn lucky, because you're not going to get this even in university. You're not going to get somebody reading a book to you, even in university, but whatever. So, but Plato was himself too much of a reactionary effort to have been content with simply criticizing or even condemning the Athenian misrepresentation of democracy. So again, Athenian misrepresentation of democracy. So this is just modern speech, Yeah, the Athenians weren't doing democracy. Like, then who was? You know what I mean? But anyway, Plato's reactionary philosophy received development at the hands of the Christian intellectuals. For when they needed a philosophy to buttress their division between heavenly order and an earthly order, it was to Plato, and to a lesser extent Plotinus, that they turned, right? So again, he's jumping into the modern Christians, right? So it is important to see, well, not the modern Christians, but the Christians later. It is important to see clearly the nature of the swing that has taken place. It started the sketch of Western philosophical thought from a time in the history of its Greek founders when an aristocratic class, assisted by a priestly oligarchy, held a sum total of social political power. The earliest philosophers rebelling against the social order with the theological explanation of natural phenomena went to the root of the matter by introducing a different kind of explanation of social and natural phenomena. The social implication of this metaphysics was a certain egalitarianism which theoretically implied democracy and socialism, as the secular metaphysics with its the secular metaphysics with its concern for the fundamental identity of man suffered corruption, it tended towards a subjective idealism, change which was complete by the time of the sophists. And the political image of subjective idealism is anarchism. Socrates and some of his students were largely instrumental in checking the rise of anarchism, which the sophists, both by their precept and their moral neutrality, were already fostering. But the very egalitarianism which Socrates was in a limited way endeavoring to save in its objective form had by this time accommodated elements of the sophist teaching. It had bred a rapacious individualism which could not take correction lightly. The system destroyed Socrates, and Socrates' soi-disant avenger, Plato, sought in, and by the way, soi-disant, one of my favorite words, self-described, right? Anyway, soi-disant avenger, so self-described avenger, Plato sought in turn to destroy even this limited democracy. In this attempt, he only succeeded in adumbrating a philosophy which could be used in supporting a society in which one class sat on the neck of another. It encouraged a new oligarchy, and this new oligarchy of the Dark and Middle Ages, like the one from which we started, sought its sacerdotal ally. So that's sacerdotal, basically religious ally. So basically, he's like, all right, so I'll do it. So it is that Plato, in trying to avenge the defender of human equality, the man who always said that men did not differ as men, any more than bees differed as bees, helped ironically in instituting his more complete overthrow. So one of the things you want to know about Western philosophy is a big quote that says all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato, right? So basically everything that we talk about today is a footnote to Plato. Plato does, if you guys remember, I actually read... we had a book club for Yurugu, so check out that book club. But we talked about Yurugu, and basically, remember, Ani really grills into Plato, and she doesn't like his hierarchies and so on and so forth. This oligarchy, so on and so forth. So this would actually be, if we didn't have the backstory, this would be a pretty damn difficult paragraph to read, right? But luckily, he gave us two paragraphs to read. But luckily, he gave us the big backdrop. And so, long story short, what he's saying is that, essentially, first there was this religious oligarchy, this priestly oligarchy. Then the philosophers, with a new economy, said, hey, no, we shouldn't have a priestly oligarchy. We should have, egalitarianism. We should have equality. We should have democracy. And then later on, Plato comes along and says, nope, democracy didn't work. We should have an oligarchy, and then the religious priesthood, the new religious priesthood, the Christians, came along and said, yeah, let's have an oligarchy, let's oppress people, and so this comes full circle. So anyway, a few centuries later, Platonism having been seized upon, the priesthood set up about acquiring an empire and political power. The world was treated to be a rehash of the old familiar arguments and re-encumbered with a theological explanation of the cosmos. Heraclitus' hypothesis that neither God nor man had made the universe was swamped with earnest pietism. The priests emphasized their role of experts on matters divine, and since this world was held to be but a dividend of divine enterprise, they claimed expertise on mundane matters as well. Deeply in league with the aristocrats, they plunged Europe into the Dark Ages and the most terrible feudalism which history records, as the church exercised her divine right of garb. So basically, he's talking about the political takeover of the church, right? So the church, however, was not allowed to hold imperial sway long, whereas the Pope had been an equal and colleague of Charlemagne. With the accession of Otto I, he sank to a junior position. Indeed, he was beholden to Otto for quelling the Italian threats to the papacy. With the emergence in this way of the secular emperor as a protector of the Pope, the whole question of the relation between church and state was vigorously broached. And secularists argued that as the Pope had not founded an empire, he could not rule one. Now, the Pope's claim to earthly sway had drawn inspiration from St. Augustine's Civitate Dei, which was itself milked from Plato and Plotinus. While pretending that she was only interested in the higher reality of heaven, the church was not reluctant to embroil herself in the sordidness of power politics. So again, basically, eventually the church and state eventually comes about after the Pope, or the Pope or whatever, or the Wazingo's Pope is secondary to the Emperor of Italy, right? Okay, all right. So with the Pope at bay, the effectiveness of Platonist philosophy as the ideology of papal sway was seriously compromised, for it could not ensure the continued ascendancy of the Pope. With Plato thus discredited, the church turned to Aristotle, Plato's telling critic. Now, for those of you who haven't read Stolen Legacy kind of asserts that Aristotle just legit copied the whole of just legit plagiarized all his work, more or less all of his work, or just like went to the I think it's called the big library in Egypt. He just went to the big library in Egypt and just rewrote the books under his name before they burned the library. You know what I mean? But anyway, so it's kind of interesting. He says Plato's telling critic. Just a FYI. Go read Stolen Legacy if you can. All right. Anyway, so let's say Aristotle was a champion of. If you didn't already. Anyway, Aristotle was a champion of some form of democracy. He connected democracy with knowledge by saying that the truth on any matter had several sides, but no single person could encompass in his individual gaze. Any individual could only grasp a portion, and it was thought that collaboration of many that the whole truth was attained. One social political significance of this is the rejection of anarchism, the political extreme of individualism. Aristotle did not, however, believe that each man was able to contribute to the truth. In this, he was reflecting in his thinking what was a social fact in Greece. To say that each man was able to contribute to the truth would require at the social level that each man should have political rights. To say that each man was equally able to contribute to the truth would require that each man should have equal political rights. The facts of Greek society were not in accord with this. Democracy of the Greeks was a democracy which was supported in the main by slave labor. Aristotle criticized neither the inequality of the sexes nor the exploitation of slave labor. He even thought that slavery was right because the slave was naturally inferior to his master. Such men, he said, were by nature not their own. He enjoined his fellow countrymen not to enslave Greeks, but only an inferior race with less spirit. Now again, when I said that he plagiarized ancient Egypt, I don't mean everything that he said was ancient Egypt, okay? Or ancient Kemet, but definitely check out Stolen Legacy, because he shows you the parallels between ancient Greek and Aristotle's writings and ancient Egypt and ancient Kemet writing. He also shows you other Greek philosophers and how they relate. So that's really it was one of my favorite books. Particularly when I was trying to get into consciousness. So, and it's also kind of like philosophical like this. So it definitely help you in your next reading of Kwame and Nkrumah, or check out The Joke, because they're both kind of like westernized Pan-Africanist, misogynist. Anyway, according to Aristotle, the state is not a mere aggregate of men, but a union of individuals bent on a common goal through cooperative action. It has for its purpose the pursuit of a higher good. Men, he, however, said, are not the same and do not perform the same function in the pursuit of this common goal. At the same time, no man can be his single exertion bring about the highest good. The state is therefore founded upon an independence of men pursuing the same ultimate goal. So that's not even a bad definition of the state. Anyway, Aristotle was prevented from fully appreciating egalitarianism by... And so you kind of see that... Now, this is the kind of thing that I'm going to say. So Nkrumah does put a lot of shade on these thinkers and says, oh, they're wrong about this, they're wrong about that. And he gives his opinion on that. And it's fine. It's all well and good. But I think that one of the things we have to also recognize is that, like, these people have been dead for 3,000 years. You know? Like it's either I would just skip over them entirely. I wouldn't even talk about them. Or if I do talk about them, I'll just say what they said. I mean, I get the point of shading them and criticizing them. I get it. But I'm just kind of like, this is a lot of pages devoted to people that you don't agree with who have been dead for 30 years. Or sorry, for 3,000 years, right? So it's just a little unusual. You know, it's a little unusual, but I get it and I don't get it. You know? Like I get it and I don't get it. You know? Because it's like, yeah, they're wrong. You know, they're wrong. And it's like, yeah, maybe I guess, like, I don't know who you're talking to, where you need to tell people that people from 2,500 years ago from a different country, a different land, altogether are wrong, right? Because, like, why would anybody really care that these dead people were wrong, you know, before, like, 2,500 years ago? But, like, what's the point of that? Like, I don't fully grasp that. But I also see why, like, if I were to tell you, like, because that's what I do too. Like, if I tell you somebody and I'm like, well, this is where they got it wrong. You know what I mean? Like, you want to do that, but, like, to what degree you would do that is the question. Because, like, even for my Book of Power, for instance, you know, I would tell you, like, I would give you somebody speaking, and I would tell you they're wrong in, like, but, like, in a sentence. You know what I mean? Like, I would legit just tell you they're wrong. Like, there's no, I don't have no 30 pages of my writing strictly on somebody else's work, you know, or body of work. Anyway, so Aristotle was prevented from fully appreciating egalitarianism by this superstitious... sorry, for those of you who might be like, well, he's not really talking 30 pages on just Aristotle. He's just, you know, blah, blah, blah. Like, again, like I'm saying, it's kind of interesting, all right? So Aristotle was prevented from fully appreciating egalitarianism by his superstitious reverence for facts. The interdependence of the members of society implies the illegitimacy of the pursuit of sectional interests above the common good, or the achievement of a latter as a mere byproduct of the pursuit of the former. He has, however, been often misunderstood when he stresses that there are differences among men. Egalitarianism cannot mean the absence of differences. It does not require this. It recognizes and accepts differences among men, but allows them to make a difference only at the functional level. Beyond that, the differences are not allowed to make a difference, certainly not at the level of the intrinsic worth of the individual. So, again, you know, that's what I was saying before. It's like, you know, we can say that people are equal, but... we might have, like, I would also accept that there are differences among people, you know, necessarily, you know. Anyway, thus, it was not enough for Aristotle to recognize that there were slaves. He should have criticized the institution of slavery. For reverence for facts does not mean inebriation with them. So he's like, he should have, like, you know, it's like, the guy's like 3,000 years dead. And you're like, you should have criticized slavery. It's like, and it wasn't even like, it's not like he was enslaving African people. You know, as far as I understand. And, like, if he were enslaving African people, it wasn't, like, Ghanaians. You know what I mean? like you know, like, it's like nothing to do with me. You know what I mean? But that's another thing that we tend to do in the Western world, where we just kind of, like, identify with, the enslaved, you know? Even if this has nothing to do with us. It's like, you're in the middle of Athens. You know, you're probably, you know, like a white person, maybe. You know what I mean? Anyway, so you should have criticized the institution of slavery. The reference for facts does not mean inebriation with them. It does not mean that they cannot be appraised, criticized, and undermined. To say that slavery was a fact was not to bless it. Its economic importance to Greek society should not have hoodwinked Aristotle into thinking it necessary or even acceptable. For a society, according to him, is a complementary and cooperative plurality of men. Let it be added that cooperation is free. When Aristotle himself came to consider how cooperation might be made spontaneous, he always underscored the necessity of education, never of tyranny or injustice. So another thing I want to point out too, cooperation between a nation is not free. You know, like, we're in first, I'm in America, sorry, but, like, I have to pay America. I have to pay America for a lot of things. I have to pay America to, you know, for them to maintain their roads, for them to maintain their law enforcement, for them to maintain their courts, for them to maintain their trading and their ports and all that kind of stuff. Like, you pay them. It's not free. Just FYI. Anyway, so man says, and that's why a lot of us can't necessarily say we're innocent of whatever it is we're doing. Anyway, so let's say man says Aristotle aims at the good, but man says Aristotle aims at the good, but how can a continuing slave be said to aim at anything? According to Aristotle, the principle of order in a political society is justice, the bond of men in states. But what justice can slaves be said to enjoy? Aristotle, usually tough-minded, becomes all too delicate when he writes about slavery. At the same time, his writing about slavery have been distorted. When he defines a slave as someone who is by nature not his own but another's, human being and yet a possession, is he implying that there can be men who by their own nature as men are not their own but others? A man cannot be discovered to be a slave through an examination of his nature. What Aristotle means is that if someone is a slave, then it follows that he is not his own but another's, human beings, and yet a possession. Now, I also want to point out this too, that a lot of times we have this discouragement, this disdain for slavery because of what America and the Western world had done, which is chattel slavery. But we also have to realize that slavery can also just mean being landless. When you do not have land in a land economy, then you are effectively a slave. You understand? And so this is the way that it is actually in the Western world already, where a lot of African people do not have land. And so we have to work for Wazungu in order that Wazungu can give us currency so that we can use that currency to get food, right? And the only reason why we don't call it slavery is because we get some currency, right? But of course that currency and the cost of living is fixed. So there's this other sister I quoted inside of the Pro-Black Compendium, and that's why I definitely want you guys to check out the Pro-Black Compendium. But she writes, because at one time I had this book that was like African American quotes or something like that, or like just black quotes or whatever, and it was really helpful for me. So that's why I put it in the Pro-Black Compendium. It's really helpful to just familiarize yourself with black thoughts, even if they're short and concise. But anyway, this lady named Carolina Maria de Jesus, and what she says is actually we are slaves to the cost of living. Right, so she's I think in Brazil, and what she says is that actually we're slaves to the cost of living. That's what it is. Like there's a cost of living in the Western world, and other people fix it. The only people who don't have a cost of living are the people with land. Because they like at best their labor is the cost of living. But other than that, yeah, so it's like when we talk about slavery, or when even Aristotle's talking about slavery, like we have to realize that it's not necessarily the same thing as, we're going to whip you, and we're going to brand you, and we're going to sell you, and we're going to hurt you. It could just be, hey, you don't have any land, but, so you got to work for me so that you could eat and function. So again, you fast forward, from this time to the time of Sunjata. Sunjata writes this constitution, and in this constitution, he does say that slaves who like manage the farm can get every third cow born or something like that. So basically, if you don't have a farm, you would work on somebody else's farm, and then every third cow that you help to birth, right? Because you're like a farmhand or whatever, you would then get that cow as a possession. So that's like a form of currency. But the point is that you're technically a slave, even though you're getting compensation in the form of a cow or whatever. You're technically a slave because you're landless. Another thing that happened in Sunjata's story was that I think the landless people, in a sense, would become soldiers. That's another thing. So a lot of it has to do with you come into another community, right? Or you're in another community and you don't really have a home. And so how can you find yourself in that other community? So it's kind of like indentured servitude in that sense. But like it's just a older human institution that in our modern eyes, we look at it and say, oh, that's slavery. They're not getting paid. There's no wages. But you have to remember too that up until the industrial age, there weren't really wages anyway. Like nobody was really getting paid wages per se. Or like wages, not like the peasants weren't really being paid wages, or if they were, I don't it's not like, again, like some peasants maybe, but again, the emphasis is more so on land and livability and that kind of thing, and just really like an economic analysis is what we have to go about with. I hope you guys are enjoying this. I'm enjoying this. It's a pretty good book. All right. Let me actually go and give my son some stuff. You guys listen to this, all right?
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Pro-Black Perspective on KWAZ Radio.
Yeah, so one of the few reasons why I would want to be married is so that, you can have somebody busy with your kid while you do things like this. But, until that happens, you got to be the Baba that does it all, right? All right, anyway, let's go. Initial egalitarianism does not predetermine its own future course. Its course depends on facts of production and the social-economic relations consequent of such facts. Initial egalitarianism can be perverted into a cruel and grasping social atomism, a barbaric free-for-all in which each man is said to be for himself and God for us all. This is the kind of course seminal in Aristotle's egalitarianism. In order to destroy the Platonic philosophical basis of oligarchy, as I've already mentioned, Aristotle rejected the Platonic hypothesis about the knowledge of truth. To Plato's mind, the truth can only be perceived and appreciated by the highest reasons subjected to the most exacting discipline. Political and social trust was therefore accessible only to the brainwashed minds of his intellectual oligarchy. Aristotle rejected this. Sorry. I'm thinking to myself, am I explaining this well enough to you guys? Because I just read that thing. But you kind of get it. So social atomism just basically means that, the whole society is now atomized. It's just each individual, as opposed to, every individual having equal rights. It's like every individual can just be themselves. They're only responsible to themselves, right? All right, so he's like, he goes back to Plato and Aristotle's feud, where he says, philosophical basis of oligarchy, as I've already mentioned, Aristotle rejected the Platonic hypothesis about the knowledge of truth. To Plato's mind, the truth can only be perceived and appreciated by the highest reason subjected to the most exacting disciplines. Basically, it's like, only people that get the truth are the people who go to the best schools, pretty much, right? So political and social truth was therefore accessible only to the brainwashed minds of his intellectual oligarchy. Now, he doesn't have to call them brainwashed, but, again, he doesn't like them, right? Anyway, he's like socialist, right? He's just a firmly socialist, where he has to, one of the things you want to do when you're writing is that every writing is propaganda. This is a propaganda piece, okay? So he's just letting you know, look, Aristotle's hierarchy is wrong. So just in case he's describing Aristotle too damn well, so that people are like, yeah, that's a pretty good book. I gotta go look at Aristotle. I agree with him. He's just like, no, just brainwashing people. You know what I mean? That's it. It's an oligarchy, That's what it is. So Aristotle rejected this and made the truth accessible to all and possible of appreciation by all. Plato, to make sure that the truth was really out of reach of many, deposited it in a heavenly bank. He called his truth forms, and he made them the airy population of a gossamer heaven. Just as Marx stood Hegel's ideas on its head, so Aristotle recalled the forms back to earth and restored them to nature, the nature which is open to us all and with which we are all familiar. He denied that the forms were capable of existence outside natural objects. He held that whoever was capable of observing natural objects was capable of detecting forms, but in any case he impugned the forms on the grounds of their utter uselessness as instruments of knowledge or of explanation. No carpenter, he said, first studied a form in order to make his furniture. So obviously, for those of you who are familiar with Plato's form theory and Aristotle's rejection of it, he's saying that, realistically speaking, knowledge is really more accessible to everybody. Now, again, this whole nature thing, for those of you, again, you want to go back to this Kemet self-knowledge Proverbs, and you'll see that there's, in ancient Kemet, one of the ideas is that the best and shortest road towards knowledge of truth is nature, right? So, I could actually show you guys that screen really quickly. Let's see if this is it. Yeah, so it says right there, it says the best and shortest road towards knowledge of truth is nature. So there's a whole bunch of different proverbs and quotes. You can kind of see that it's kind of taken from this white boy's work, and it's not even taken directly from his work, but it's like summarized from his work. But notwithstanding, it's a pretty interesting because this is the kind of things that you would probably learn, or at least Wazungu would probably learn while they were walking around Kemet, you know? So it's just one of those interesting things to also check back with whenever you want to. I actually have them also in the Book of Power. Oh, sorry, no, in the Pro-Black Compendium. So, you know, like I made sure to give you guys some good stuff, you know? I'm that guy. All right, let's keep going. With the church's embracing of neo-Aristotelianism, she saved herself in the nick of time, for she thus adopted a philosophical standpoint which enabled her to make concessions to the Renaissance and man's regained social importance. So what he's saying is that the church was, you know, losing influence at one point, and then they said, hey, you know what? Let's look at Aristotle again, right? So nevertheless, in his anxiety to restore the egalitarian form of society, Aristotle actually tried to arrest the dialectic of thought. He tried to secure his arrest by laying down his categories. According to him, these categories are the most general concepts under which the world can be thought of. There is no object or process in nature which does not, so far as it can be conceived, fall under one or more of the categories, examples of which are quality, quantity, rest, motion, time, place. A great deal of metaphysics in such a view can therefore only consist of the identifying of these categories and the elucidation of them. But in this way, also an attempt is made to fix in advance the form of any future metaphysics. Indeed, prolegomena to future metaphysics are commonplaces of philosophy. These prolegomenas, you don't know what that is, are a kind of preface written by philosophers and addressed to all future philosophers. In these prefaces, the authors lay down the limits, the purposes, and the forms which they claim must guide all future philosophies. So Kant is another example of a philosopher who identified the basic concepts in terms of which alone nature can appear to us and become intelligible. The motive lying behind prolegomena. All right, so let me go look this up. Oh my gosh, you know, you're like, okay, maybe he's just gonna say it once, and you can leave it alone, but because he just keeps saying it, prolegomena is a critical or discursive introduction to a book. Okay, all right, so yeah, actually, Immanuel Kant actually has a book called Prolegomena to Any Future. To any future, maybe metaphysics, I don't know, but okay, so I'm just checking to see what things were. But all right, so basically it's like this introduction. So basically, these prolegomenas are a kind of preface written by philosophers to address all future philosophers, right? And it's basically Aristotle is saying, hey, look, if you're going to categorize anything, it has to be that, you know, the quality. Like basically just trying to make it scientific in a sense, but, you know, when you look at it from a dialectical, like a Hegelian dialectical view, it could be limiting, and that's what Nkrumah's paradigm, right? So Kant is another example of who identify basic concepts in terms of what alone nature can show. So the motive behind prolegomena is a natural one, in certain circumstances even commendable. Is an attempt to make sure that one's philosophical insight shall be conserved, an attempt to persuade the world that all the spade work of philosophy has been done, that all there is left to do is build upon this final foundation. It is a claim to perfection. So he's like, yeah, you know, sometimes you do this, and it's a good thing. Like, it seems good. You know, you're like, hey, look, I laid the foundation, now build, right? Anyway. So in the political sphere, Aristotle made a similar claim to perfection. Having analyzed the nature of a democratic constitution, he said that it was the natural way of organizing society. To claim that it is unnatural is to contrast it with other types of constitution, which are presumably unnatural or less natural. By a natural constitution, Aristotle meant one which consorted most with the talents of man and the ethics which best suited him. A natural constitution was therefore, for him, one which gave political expression to the nature of man. In saying, therefore, that a democratic constitution is a natural way of organizing society, he was claiming perfection for it. Plato was called a Syracuse to educate a future ruler. Was called to Syracuse to educate So Plato was called to Syracuse, that's a location, to educate a future ruler. There he saw a beautiful opportunity of producing a ruler tailored to this political ideas. He seized the opportunity and failed, so he returned to Athens a disappointed man. Aristotle too had responsibility for the education of Alexander, later called the Great, but the democratic seeds which he sowed withered in Alexander's barren ground. These two great philosophers of antiquity, so full of ideas for the regeneration of society, utterly lacked the power to bring them to social fruition. So again, you know, I do want to say, you know, you have these ideas, but you should engage people who have power. Okay, you want these people with power to get these ideas. Now, that's not to say that it's always going to work. It didn't work for Plato, and according to Kwame and Nkrumah, it didn't work for Aristotle, right? But I would say we'd have to look into it, but I would believe that Aristotle's ideas come after the conquest that Alexander does, right? But anyway, we'll see. One interesting point is that, but I mean, obviously that could easily be fact checked and easily disproven or easily be proven. So I don't really care that much. Like I said, these are people who died 2,500 years ago or what have you, right? Anyway, so one interesting point is that the difference between them, notwithstanding, Plato and Aristotle both conceived society in static terms. Their conception was of a society which permitted of no revision. In Plato's view, once society has been set up according to the provisions outlined in the Republic, the perfect society would have been attained, and what is perfect cannot change for the better. In this way, he introduced the idea of a finite social evolution. And Aristotle, to the extent that he regarded the democratic society as the perfect form of society, also operated the idea of a finite social evolution. And that's not something that you can fault people on. It's just like how we're like, hey, we want Pan-African. Like one of the things I can say is this: people talk about Pan-Africanism, and I'm like, look. I wouldn't mind African people having the world, having the planet, but like Pan-Africanism to me, just Africans uniting the continent is too small, right? You're telling the people of the future, hey, just unite the continent, then you're good, right? Or just unite the continent and the Caribbean, then you're good. And instead of, realistically speaking, if you had power, you would go out into other parts of the world too, like what Zungu did. Zungu wasn't like, hey, I got Europe, I got England, so I'm good. No, he's like, look, or like Germany was trying to do. It's like, I got Germany. We united Germany. We're good. No, it's like, no, what? I want to grab some of France. I want to grab some of England. I want to go around the world. I want to freaking have a global domination. It's not to say that you want global domination per se, but what you realize is that the people of the future, the people with power, are going to make the decisions for themselves. And you can't tell them, oh, well, you could. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what you think. Oh, well, leave the Europeans to Europe. Leave the Europe to the Europeans. Again, if anybody had that mentality, the reality is that the Amerindian would have America, but he doesn't. Anyway, so one interesting point is that the difference between and I'm not saying that I like that or I agree with that. And I was actually reading some of Garvey, where he's just like, yeah, he took that, white boy took that, and you're like, but I'm just saying, like real world is that. The world is filled with dynamic human beings that change and do things. But anyway, so though neither Plato nor Aristotle had the power to bring his ideas to a social fruition, Europe threw up men who had the power and the will, but not the good fortune to implement the perfect society. Napoleon was such a person. And of the Prussian state, Hegel confessed that it represented the political incarnation of his absolute idea, the march of God in history. Hitler, too, in our own time, sought to introduce the perfect society. Since the perfect society is conceived in terms of terminal of social evolution, its procreators have persistently envisaged millennia of unruffled monotony, right? So again, like that's the same with Pan-Africanism. It's really just another one of those, unruffled monotony. Oh, we have Africa. We're done. It's complete, Like, I remember I was on social media and I was like, I said, yeah, Pan-Africanism is like the unity of the continent is not the end goal. There's no end goal. Shout out to a lot of the brothers and sisters out there. But some people are like, hey, like spacefaring is an option. Having colonies on the moon is an option. Having colonies on Mars is an option. Having colonies outside of the solar system is an option. There's no limit to human development. No limit to human growth. The humans should not be limited by our imagination. They should be propelled by their own imaginations. Our future generations should be propelled by our own. And what we have to do is just have our imagination propelled as well. Like, we have to just set the model of pursuing our own autonomy. Sorry. Anyway, so sorry. I have suggested that the attempts to fix categories. I might have to drink some water. I suggested that the attempts to fix categories, basic, general concepts in terms of. I suggest that the attempts to fix categories, basic general concepts in terms of which alone the world must appear to us and become intelligible, is an attempt to halt the dialectic of thought and attempt to freeze it at a certain stage. In the dialectic of thought, a cardinal idea is introduced and is worked out in considerable detail. After a certain point, an idea antithetic to it appears on the scene, and in attempts. Sorry, I got distracted. I got distracted because of that sickness. I suggested in the attempt to fix categories, basic general concepts in terms of which alone the world must appear to us and become intelligible, is an attempt to halt the dialectic of thought, an attempt to freeze it at a certain stage. In the dialectic of thought, a cardinal idea is introduced and it worked out in considerable detail. After a certain point, an idea antithetic to it appears on the scene, and in an attempt to reconcile them, a new idea is produced, and this new idea initiates a similar process. In laying down basic concepts which cannot admit of revision, Aristotle was attempting to halt the dialectic of thought. So basically, again, Kwame Nkrumah is just telling you he's a dialectical, he's following the Hegelian dialectic. He's a dialectical materialist, and so anything that's contrary to dialectical materialism is not worthy. Again, I don't know why you spent 30 pages on telling us something that's not worthy, but it is what it is, right? All right. Yeah, I'm sick. All right. I also suggest that in the social field, Aristotle tried to arrest the dialectics of society, for in his treatment of the democratic society as the perfect form of society, he was attempting to lay down a terminal to social evolution, and so to thwart dialectic. And yet, his own position represents a stage in the unfolding of social dialectic. The egalitarianism which early Greek philosophy introduced could be formulated in terms of individualism, and Aristotle's democratic ideal was in its insistence on an equal individualism was, after all, a particular way of spelling out the egalitarianism which the earlier Greek philosophers pitted against the sacerdotal aristocratic oligarchy. To the extent that the individualism accepts it as axiomatic the initial equal value of the individual, egalitarianism can be formulated in terms of it. But evidently, individualism alone cannot determine the form of social organization, but individualism may lead to capitalism or it may lead to socialism, right? So, this is, of course, a dialectical materialism in the sense of you have the thesis, you have the antithesis, and then you have the synthesis. So, he's saying that it's ironic that that Plato was not going for the Hegelian dialectic, 2,000 years before it. It's ironic that he wasn't doing the Hegelian dialectic because his own idea was a synthesis of a thesis and antithesis before him, right? And he should have just seen the pattern that every idea is going to have a synthesis, an antithesis, and a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. But that's that's just claiming a Hegelian dialectic. It's not necessarily a truism, but it is true to Nkrumah. So Nkrumah then thinks. So this is like one of those things about if you were to say religious, or dogmatic. This is like a dogmatism in the sense that he's saying, hey, you know what? I'm critiquing you because you didn't follow this philosophy from 2,000 years after you were after you died, and it's like, yeah, but why would anybody follow something from 2,000 years after they died, I don't even know what's going on, it's just I get it, but I don't get it, but it is what it is, right? So anyway, so if one takes for the sake of an example the economic doctrines of John Stuart Mill, one must confess that he based them on a passionate individualism. So he's saying, so one thing you also want to pick up on is that he says individualism can lead to capitalism and it can lead to socialism. So socialism is an individualist ideology. But again, one of the things that we also remember, and we should also point out, is that socialism comes about through capitalism. So it's not like, so it's kind of like a misnomer, in the sense that socialism is that synthesis of the thesis for capitalism and or even if you were to say the thesis for capitalism, the antithesis for socialism, and the synthesis for communism, right? But anyway, if one takes for the sake of an example the economic doctrines of John Stuart Mill, one must confess that he based them on a passionate individualism. Indeed, so passionate was his defense of individualism that he required governments to exercise the minimum of regulation on citizens. He advocated free economic activity, but true as it is that in Mill's doctrine every citizen had the right to free economic activity, in the context of an already technical society, this meant little. In the technical society, this would inevitably breed an economic disproportion, and it would head society straight towards capitalism, right? So technical society is basically saying that technical society basically means society with capital, society with people having property producing wealth, and some people, not everybody would have that property producing wealth, and so you'll have that economic disproportion regardless. For socialism, you still have a technical society, but no individual or basically the state in a sense would have those economic producing enterprises. So it's not that a certain family is building boats; it's that the government is building boats, and the profit from that boat creation, the boat trade, if you will, is going to the people through the government, as opposed to going to certain individuals who are doing it. Now, what this means for this is obviously the socialist versus capitalist argument, and you could analyze that on your own time. Obviously, if it comes up, I could try to help you understand it, but you pretty much get what I'm saying. And of course, anybody ever, if you're listening and you're like, hey, you know what, Oni, I'd like to have a discussion with you, right? I'd like to have a live discussion with you on certain subjects. Come through, okay? Come through. Anyway, so if, however, one considers individualism not as given to men and equal, but like for real though. All right, let me stop. All right. If, however, one considers individualism not as giving to men an equal right to dominate and exploit one another, but as imposing upon all the duty to support one another and make the happiness of others a condition for the happiness of oneself, then individualism so conceived and practiced heads toward society, toward socialism. So he's like, let's go back to that. If one considers individuals not as giving men an equal right to dominate and exploit one another, but as imposing upon all the duty to support one another. So basically he's saying the difference between socialism and capitalism, in his mind, right, is that you have individuals, and so in capitalism you have individuals who have an equal right to dominate and exploit one another, right? Hey, look, I can pay you for pennies to do this, right? And that's his vision of capitalism. Like, it's just, you have the right, you have an equal right among everybody else to exploit people, but of course you don't have property, so you can't exploit other people like the people with property can. Notwithstanding, he's like, but socialism is more so, everybody has a duty to support everybody else and make the happiness of others a condition for the happiness of themselves, and that right there is socialism. It's utopic. It sounds pretty good, but whether this is like a real system is left for discussion, right? Or at least whether it's a real Western system is also left for discussion, because like I said, I was in Africa, I was in Ghana, and it was pretty happy, pretty crimeless, pretty nice. I'm not gonna say happy, but it was, oh my gosh, right? There's this guy named Tennyson. He says it is better to have loved and lost than to have never really loved at all, right? And so I don't actually know. I do not know whether it's better to have loved and lost than never loved at all, because I'm just like saying to myself, damn, I should have been in Africa. Yeah. So look, guys, listen to me right here. I need to support myself while I'm in Africa. I want to support myself as an author. So let me know what you want me to write, okay? Let me know what you think could sell in writing. And like whether it's the short stories, whether it's fiction, whether it's philosophy text, like let me know. Like help a brother out. We're in this market economy, and I want to be more marketable so that when I'm in Africa I could just enjoy myself. Like, we talk about the socialism thing and happiness of others for happiness of self. I'm letting you know how I can be happy. So so help a brother out, all right? As they go, WB, Warner Brother, you know what I'm saying? All right. It's precisely because the individual does not determine the form of social organization that both the capitalistic and the socialistic traditions in Europe can trace their origin to the earliest Greek philosophers. Indeed, because the cultural history of Europe is the unfolding of a social dialectic, it is hardly surprising that antithetic strands of thought should simultaneously trace their spring and origin to the same cradle. Dialectic would not be full unless the antithesis was present. At this point, so you see that's just the same thing I was talking about. I really just described it to you a lot so that you're not like blindsided when he starts talking about it, right? Alright, so at this point I must go back to the Renaissance, because the Renaissance is often conceived of as the emancipation of thought, as the time when thinking. At this point I must go back to the Renaissance, because the Renaissance is often conceived of as the emancipation of thought, as the time when thinking freed itself of all social and other limiting shackles. So the Renaissance. Okay, so you just go back to the Renaissance. It's a time for him where where it's a time where he thinks it's conceived. It's most people accept that this is the emancipation of thought, and where it's freed of all social limiting shackles. So the Renaissance did indeed free itself from certain specific shackles. For example, it was in spirit profoundly non-religious. This particular aspect of it, however, remained largely endemic in the 16th century, except in the works of a few like Rabelais, who in his thought rejected Catholicism as well as Protestantism as huge irrelevances to Christianity. In order to negate the emancipation, Christian theology swiftly modified its position here and accepted a compromise there. The humanism to which the Renaissance gave rise served as the link between the emancipation of thought from religious shackles and the strengthening of capitalism, for it raised from the economic sphere the unfeeling competition and pursuit of supremacy which characterizes capitalism, and transposed them to a philosophical conception in which each man, armed with his natural and inalienable rights, is pitted against every other man. This transposition became a tour de force in the political philosophy of John Locke, and is this political philosophy which largely inspired the American Constitution. So, he's just going over the history of the Renaissance and the different philosophers of the Renaissance, John Locke and the American Constitution, and so on and so forth, right? So both the Renaissance and the humanism, which is fortified, were the second Renaissance and humanism. The first Renaissance and humanism were represented by Aristotle. He too, as I have tried to show, represented man as the center of the universe and made the limit of knowledge coincide with the limits of the human understanding, and reclaiming the forms and putting them back in nature, and also in his fixing of the categories of thought, which were at the same time the categories of being. His humanism was a cooperative one in which each man, perceiving a different aspect of the truth, contributed into the common whole. Aristotle saved thought from the mystic vapors with which Plato surrounded it. The second Renaissance emancipated thought from the mysticism of the Middle Ages. But whereas Aristotle stood for a cooperative humanism, the second humanism was an atomistic one. This atomistic again is like super individualism, like every person for themselves, right? So this atomistic humanism was assisted by the travels of merchants and adventurers who, returning with tales of diverse social organization, diverse moral and religious principles and practices, assisted the growth of the thought that there could be no universally valid single religious creed, morality, or social order. This thought confirmed their challenge of the church hegemony. So, travel is one of the best teachers. Shout out to D. Webb from the Harsh Reality podcast, who tends to say that. But travel is one of the best teachers of one of the best teachers. So, like, for instance, for me, I go to Ghana and I'm like, damn, I'm living in a really antisocial life. Like, I'm legit talking to a microphone and reading a book, and I don't expect anybody to listen to it. You know what I'm saying? It's like, damn, right? That's my life. Like, while I was in Africa, I was like, cavorting and talking and, I don't know if I use the word right, cavorting, right? But, talking and socializing and engaging people and, going to the restaurant and sitting in diners and engaging the cooks and all that kind of stuff. Doing all that, and here in America, I'm like, hey, deliver my food to me. And I'm just going to sit in my house, Right? I was like, damn, oh, man. All right. So, but the point being that, this happened the same, the quote, he calls it the second stage of humanism. But of course, this is really, really, really focused on Europe. Like, it's not even a joke. Like, what were African people doing at this point? I don't know. All I know is that there was a second humanism in Europe, and Aristotle, the first humanism, and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's like, ugh. All right. But anyway, but he's like, they went, they studied, they went abroad, and they were like, maybe there's no single religious creed. Maybe this church hegemony is not something that we should be going under, right? But anyway, but just as John Locke's political philosophy was a humanist attempt to assert the personal and independent dignity of man and make man, not God, the reference point of political organization, so in his empiricist philosophy, he attempted to make man the center and source of knowledge. Since knowledge is thus not a matter of divine revelation, but one of human mental activity, man's intellectual independence and dignity was by this token asserted. I have said that in the face of the humanism which the Renaissance developed, the church preserved herself by making a concession here and there, here and a compromise there, thus avoiding a head-on collision. The church became subtle, and while seeming to endorse the philosophies of humanism, tried to place God at their center. She ran with the hare and hunted with the hounds. In the philosophy of, so it's like she did both. She was both chased and she was both chasing. You know what I'm saying? She ran with the hare and hunted with the hounds. I like this brother. I like him. In the philosophy of Berkeley, empiricism, and this is the thing too. I want to point out this too. Like a lot of these misogynists, like I told you, Jope and him, they do cite these white boys big time. Now, unfortunately, I went through this Western education, so I kind of understand them. I don't like how deep they go into it, but I kind of understand them. And no, I don't intend to write a book like this myself. I hope I don't, but yeah, like this is a thing. Anyway, so in the philosophy of Berkeley, empiricism appears to be endorsed, but it is fact strictly speaking denied. For however Berkeley said the materialist object was a agglomerate of ideas, of senses, he told us that it was really God who put the ideas in our mind. So, and this is a reminder from Berkeley, he was the monist from before, when Thales was saying everything is water, Berkeley was the one who was saying everything is spirit and ideas, right? So, we're just a backdrop to chapter 1, right? All right, just a backdrop. So, again, he's organizing this book really well. He's organizing this book really well. And maybe his editor was like, hey, maybe he just like went straight into Consciencism, and then his editor was like, you got to give more background because what are you talking about? Like, nobody knows who Berkeley is, So wait, for however Berkeley said that the material objects were agglomerations of ideas of sense, he told us that they were really God who put the ideas in our mind. Sense was completely otiose in the philosophy of Berkeley. This was necessarily so because for him, our bodies were carried in our minds. Our bodies were carried in our minds, right? That's a little backwards, but whatever. The stage could not therefore be set for sensation. So impressive were the insinuations of this Berkeleyan doublespeak that the grateful church rewarded him with a bishopric. So again, so Berkeley was just this guy who was like, hey, you know what? It's really God is everything, blah, 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 blah. And then the church was like this guy, give him a let's get this guy in front of a crowd, right? Right, those of you guys who know that reference, but I'll be quiet. So anyway, the power of the church could still be felt, and philosophers like Descartes and Leibnez, inspired by fear of being recognized immediately as undermining the social power of the church in favor of humanism, prudently suppressed their definitive works, which only saw the light of day posthumously. So basically, Descartes and Leibniz didn't publish right away because they knew the church would kill them. Right? I've already said that humanism branched off into a democratic capitalism and cooperative socialism. The two philosophies of Leibniz and Descartes provides further illustration of the way in which this happened. Leibniz believed that the universe consisted of an infinite number of units, which he called monads. Each monad, right? So it's like atoms, right? Hold on a second. Let me make sure this thing's plugged in. Can you guys hear me? Okay, yeah. All right. So anyway, it's like monads. Where was I? Each monad was a spirit, but monads enjoyed different levels of consciousness, and matter, in his philosophy, was a collection of spirits which were in a complete state of unconsciousness. He was an idealist, but that was not what constituted his contribution to democratic capitalism. So basically, he just gave you this background for nothing. Anyway, but for this, we must turn to his remarks about the nature of monads. According to Leibniz, every monad is completely self-contained and is completely windowless on every other monad. Every monad is furthermore invested with a private law of its development, a law which provides something for the dimness of other monads at a time when a particular monad luxuriates in well-being. And this whole arrangement is sanctified by the principle of pre-established harmony. In social terms, this means that every individual has an inalienable right to develop according to his nature, even if his development requires the suffering and subordination of others, either in a political or an economic sense. It is in this way that Leibniz's philosophy contributes to a democratic capitalism. So, just for those of you who might not understand what he was saying, basically, he's like, yeah, everybody's entitled to their development, even if their development means that they crush the development of other people, right? And so, it's kind of like how Europe underdeveloped Africa, or, subtext, how Europe developed itself. It tells itself at the cost of Africa's development, right? Anyway. Like it's rewritten. It's like, yeah, and the Leibniz is basically saying that's the right thing to do, which is not, just like I give the example of, or I'll give this the example of somebody who's like, I'm really horny, so I'm gonna go use somebody else's body to satisfy my horniness, right? Which is a terrible thing to do, but that's what this atomism, that's what this individualism, this hyper individualism would lead to. It's like, hey, you know what? For me, for my satisfaction, my body, my bodily needs, I will, infringe on somebody else's thing. But of course, that goes back into this idea of human rights and rights, and whereas I completely wouldn't do anything of that sort. I also, I do recognize that, these are philosophical schools of thought, and these are, philosophical inheritances that we have, right? So anyway, on the other hand, but of course that sounds, it sounds terrible, so don't associate me with that. I'm just saying that we're just trying to give examples of what Nkrumah or Leibniz or whoever is trying to say. But of course, it's obviously disagreeable to, assault somebody else for your own personal desires. And actually, like I said before, that's kind of why, Plato's philosophy that I was describing was something. They say that you want to suppress your desires from by using your rationalization, right? Anyway, so let's go. On the other hand, this is the logic over, like mind over, logic over passion or something like that, or logic over desires or something like that. Anyway, so they say, and that's the hierarchy of man, the internal hierarchy in human versus the, and then you convert that to the societal hierarchy. Anyway, so anyway, on the other hand, in the philosophy of Descartes, supported is given the cooperative. So on the other hand, in the philosophy of Descartes, support is given to the cooperative socialism. Descartes begins from the position that reason is the same in all, and that fundamentally we are equally able to perceive and appreciate the same truths. We do not have private truths. We all share public objective truths and pursue them. And even when, because we have not paid full attention to the matter on hand, we have not yet ascertained the truth, we must cooperate with others in supporting the demands of others as conceived by them. Consequently, Descartes says that while he was busy doubting everything in order to appreciate what was true, he still conceived it as necessary to cooperate with others in supporting the stability and order of society. By multiplying examples to show how there is a social contention, implicit or explicit, in the thought of the philosophers, the history of philosophy, as I sketched it early on, suddenly enjoys a transfusion of blood and springs to life. These philosophies appear in situ not as abstract ethereal systems, but as intellectual weapons implying a social purpose. So he's like, hey, one of them was for the capitalism, one of them was for socialism, and they are just weapons that can be used for social purposes of either enacting capitalism or enacting socialism, right? So anyway, it is evident from the foregoing that Cartesian philosophy represented the most radical break in a social sense from the hegemony of the church and her aristocratic allies. The spread of Cartesianism in the form of free thinking, therefore, ensures that these... and by the way, for those of you that don't know, let me just say Descartes, one of the reasons why I know I'm familiar with this guy is because he's the one that does Cartesian coordinates. Those are the coordinate systems that we do in mathematics. So Leibniz, ironically, is also a mathematician. He's the one that, him along with Newton, devised calculus, right, and the language of calculus. And Cartesian, and Descartes does the Cartesian coordinates, which are the XY coordinates. The big, I want to say, square, the series of squares, or what have you, the grid, if you will. If you call it a rectangular grid if you want, but the grid-based coordinate system. So that's pretty interesting that these two mathematicians are being considered by Nkrumah. And again, Nkrumah is, like, you have to understand this too. Nkrumah's position as a president of Ghana is actually much higher than all of these people. Even if the Western world doesn't see it, even if Nkrumah doesn't see it, this is a very respectable position to be in. And I may never have the fortune because I'm not necessarily a native anywhere in Africa, but it is a huge honor. It's a huge honor, and I think that Kwame Nkrumah writing this deeply is also just very, very impressive. So, again, even though I don't like the misogyny, and I keep saying that, like I said, even though, like just the same way how Nkrumah does it, he just critiques people randomly. Like, you gotta add your critique. Even notwithstanding that, this is pretty impressive. So, appreciation to the brother. Appreciation to the ancestor. Right? So let's go. It is evident from the foregoing that Cartesian philosophy represented the most radical break in the social sense from the hegemony of the church and her aristocratic allies. The spread of Cartesianism in the form of free thinking therefore ensured that there ensued in France competing philosophies which engendered an acute social and ideological conflict. On the other hand, there was the oligarchic philosophy of the church. On the other, the egalitarian philosophy of Descartes, with its removal of the region of truth from mystic revelations to mathematical and public demonstrations. The acute social and ideological conflict so generated could only be resolved by revolution. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? Revolution is the synthesis. right? So intellectual tension has been mounting for 100 years or more. The libertines of French free thinkers had suffered persecution in crisis after crisis. 1624, the Parliament of Paris, obedient to the church, restrained certain chemists from disseminating anti-Aristotelian theses. Uncanonical, and by the way, I'm just like sick, so that's the thing. Uncanonical doctrines were prescribed, and their libertine disseminators were abused as immoralists, tricksters, and hypocrites who publicly professed religion, but in private undermined it. The Jesuits touched new heights of violence and raillery when they dealt with the libertines, who them naturally did not turn the other cheek, but delivered their riposte with the full edge of their wit, accusing the schoolmen of forgery, vanity, emptiness, and uselessness. So there's this, the revolution was brewing because there were the people who were like Descartes and the people who were at the church, and the church was trying to subjugate them, keep them under line, but eventually, maybe, possibly, the antithesis will lead to a synthesis, right? Anyway, only these 2 pages? Damn, I was having so much fun. All right, the dichotomy in French thought cleft the nation seriously. By the way, for those of you who might be like, wait, Ani, damn, this is next week or something. No, for me, this is November 3rd, okay? It's 11 a.m. and November 3rd. So whatever you were doing, November 3rd, and Wazungu's calendar, obviously. Whatever you were doing that time, this is what I was doing. All right. So this dichotomy in French thought cleft the nation seriously, and Huet, Fouquier, and Pascal contributed to this dichotomy as against Malebranche and Montaigne. By 1789, the divergence had hardened seriously, and only a revolution could reshuffle French thought and deal it out anew. In the 18th and 19th century, the social contention in philosophy became explicit, especially as law, politics, economics, and ethics came to be publicly founded on philosophy. The social contention of philosophy was accepted even as late as the Russian Revolution in 1917. So actually, let me just double check this. Because I'm thinking about the ending. I'm thinking this. I'm probably not going to premiere this, but I might tell people, hey, look, I'll premiere this if I get, I want to say 200 views on the first one. 200 views, 10 comments. If I get that, then sure, I'll premiere. But otherwise, I'll just release it, because who cares, right? It's going to be if it's 13 views, then who really cares? Why am I going to sit down and re-listen to this great podcast, obviously? But why am I going to do that if I could just be reading my next book, In the 18th and 19th centuries, the social contention in philosophy became explicit, especially as law, politics, economics, and ethics came to be publicly founded on philosophy. French thought and deal it out anew. So only revolution could do so on and so forth. So in the 18th century and 19th century, the social contention in philosophy became explicit, especially as laws, politics, economics, and ethics came to be publicly founded on philosophy. The social contention of philosophy was accepted as even as late as the Russian Revolution, so on and so forth. So basically saying that eventually by the 18th century there were laws, politics, economics, and ethics that were founded on philosophy, and even, of course, the Russian Revolution, which was, of course, a Marxist revolution, right? It is therefore not a little amazing that in the 20th century, Western philosophers should largely disinherit themselves and affect an aristocratic professional unconcern over the social realities of the day. So all comes full circle. He's and it wasn't even elegant, to be honest. It's just a straight hard break. You're thinking, okay, we're going to see how it just gradually becomes less and less relevant to society. It's nope, it just stopped, it just stopped. But anyway, that was actually not expected. But anyway, that's pretty funny. It's funny in an academic sense. You get it, okay? All right, so anyway, it is therefore not a little amazing that in the 20th century, Western philosophers should largely disinherit themselves and affect an aristocratic professional unconcern over the social realities of the day. Even the ethical philosophers say that it is not their concern to improve themselves or anybody else. They restrict their calling to disputable elucidations of moral terms, which we all know how to use correctly. They say that their professional job begins and ends with the elucidation of the meaning of moral terms and principles, and the source of moral obligation. They never purport to support and maintain any moral principles. In fact, some of them sometimes confess their inability to see or admit any difference between the statement of moral principles and brute ejaculation. On the irrelevance of social irritants and urges to the content of philosophy, Western philosophers are largely agreed. They say that they are not interested in what made a philosopher say the thing he says, but only in the reasons which he gives. Philosophy is thus effectively emasculated, and it loses its arresting power. Whereas the great philosophers, the Titans, have always been passionately interested in social reality and the welfare of man, many of these 20th century descendants in the West serenely settled down to a compilation of a dictionary of sentences as opposed to the dictionary of words. Engulfed in their intellectual heritage, they excuse themselves from philosophical comment on social progress or social oppression, on peace or war, while they thus pursue the exact sense of the word. All authority, political or moral, passes even more firmly into the hands of the politicians. Basically, what he's saying right here, obviously, is that the philosophers are now just puppets, right? But of course they are, right? And they probably, and and the thing is this too, to a large degree, they always were. It's like there always was just exceptions to the rule, you know. Like we might mention Descartes and Leibnez, but they were more than just two people in that generation. You know, there were tons of other bishops and other priests and other writers and other scholars and other so on and so forth that were just continuing the status quo. What we see, and this is something that we tend to do in the West as well among African people, is we tend to look at the exceptions and say, oh, this is the rule. You know, and I had this conversation on Twitter, you know, this is going to be weeks ago, right? But this today for me, where a lot of people are like, oh yeah, I don't like integrationists. You know, but you know, our ancestors were never about integration. But it's like, realistically speaking, if you look at the effect of society, you know, you ate at McDonald's. You know what I mean? Like you didn't just eat at, you know, Johnny's Chicken Shack or whatever. You ate at McDonald's or whatever. So, you know, I'm not even, and you know, this is obviously an African American thing. So I'm gonna try to, like, I'm trying. Like I said, I gotta divorce myself from America or whatever. But anyway, so however desiccated the new passions of some Western philosophers are, they can admittedly claim to share a continuity with a European cultural history. A non-Western student of philosophy has no excuse except a parditic one for studying Western philosophy in the same spirit. So again, now this is ironic because he's a non-Western student of philosophy. I actually don't know what parditic means though, so I'm gonna look that up really quickly. And I'm kind of biding time because I enjoy spending time with you guys, even though I know that nobody's spending time with me. But I mean, look, I'm also being tongue in cheek because I know some people are listening. I'm just being tongue in cheek. It's you know, one of the things that are funny in the Western world is to, and I'm just typing in the word paidutic or over relating to the study of teaching. It's pretty interesting. So it's kind of like pedantic. But anyway, so he's like, a non-Western student of philosophy has no excuse except for if they're trying to teach, for studying Western philosophy in the same spirit. Anyway, so he lacks even the minimal excuse of belonging to a cultural history. I know I cut off what I was saying. I'm saying that, yeah, I appreciate you guys for listening. Okay. Anyway, so he lacks even the minimal excuse of belonging to a cultural history in which the philosophies figure. In my opinion, that when we study a philosophy which is not ours, we must see it in the context of the intellectual history to which it belongs, and we must see it in the context of the milieu in which it was born. That way we can use it in the furtherance of cultural development and the strengthening of our human society. So what he kind of just wraps it up where he's like, look, yeah, it's not my cultural history. I just know it. I know the cultural history, but I'm not studying it to, you know, at best I would study to teach it. And I do think, though, however, that when you look at it from the context that it was born, you can also use that in the sense of furthering your own cultural development and strengthening your own human society. And so that, you know, I could agree with, obviously. And, you know, we're going to go, actually. That's it. So I appreciate you all for listening. This was a pro-black perspective, obviously. Enjoy your day, your summer, your life, or what have you, and make sure you come back next week. So, like I said, I'm probably going to tell people online, look, if you guys can get me those views, and look how short the views are. 200 views. Like, imagine somebody asking for 200 views. That's terrible. You know, it's short, but, you know, of course it's a long video, so I understand. But yeah, 200 views, 10 comments. You know, most of my videos are like 0 comments, but yeah, 10 comments. You do that, then sure, I can go premiere this. Premiere basically means that I'll be live, and all that jazz. Or even I could do that for the next one, but I'll think about that. Anyway, so that's the gist of this week's broadcast. This is week's worship. Other than that, Shem Yem Hotep, Al Kuja, Saneb Neb, Amen, Ma'at, du en être.